Ever wondered what bedtime looked like in a Viking longhouse? Or how Norse warriors slept with axes by their side under a roof of dripping thatch? From icy nights aboard dragon ships to the eerie songs of skalds echoing in smoky halls, this isn't just the story of raids and conquests, it's the entire story of the Viking Age, told slowly, softly, and with all the strange nighttime details they left behind. So fluff your pillow like it's a sack of moss, lie back, and let history tuck you in. Tap subscribe for more sleepy stories every week, because in this classroom, falling asleep is the goal. You begin by standing in a narrow Florentine street where the sun touches only the upper stories of buildings that lean toward one another like neighbors in quiet conversation. In front of you is a wooden sign creaking faintly over a doorway. A brush crossed with a small mortar and pestle, the signal of a painter attached to the Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries. Inside, the air is resin and chalk, a mixture of egg, linseed oil, animal glue, and alder wood, throwing off a dry perfume. The room is not grand. It is a workplace defined by its rules. A bench on the left with a series of shells for pigments, a chest with locks for gold leaf, and a small ledger, open to a neat page where a hand has scratched lines of expenses so ordinary you might miss how they shaped the century. You see the names of materials listed like a prayer. Lapis from beyond the sea, lead white ground yesterday, vermilion weighed carefully, flax cloth for straining, a shipment of poplar planks, 5 sheets of gold leaf, and a separate note for payment to the gilder, because even in a small shop, one man's time is counted precisely. The Renaissance feels heroic in memory, but on this bench it is method. The apprentice begins his day before dawn. His duties are repetitive. Sweep the space, warm the glue pot gently to avoid scorching, and prepare a fresh batch of gesso. He knows the ratios by habit more than thought. Chalk and glue in a smooth consistency, applied in many coats to a wooden panel until each layer dries to a hard surface ready to receive drawing. He will sand those layers with care, the dust collecting in the folds of his clothes, little evidence of a long craft. He is likely in his teens, bound by contract to the master for a term that pays not in coins but in knowledge and meals, with a careful exit at the end when, if all goes well, he will present a masterpiece of his own to the guild examiners. You can imagine him reciting the names of patrons that pass through, an abbess from a small convent, a silk merchant's widow who wants a room-sized painting of the Virgin for her family chapel, a confraternity representative who wants new banners for a procession later in the year. He listens more than he speaks because the shop's survival depends on these quiet negotiations, on the promises made with words and recorded with ink. The guild framework that surrounds this shop is an unseen skeleton. In Florence, painters do not belong to an artist's guild by itself. They belong to the Guild of Physicians and Apothecaries, a classification that reveals the chemistry of the trade. Pigments are not merely colors, but compounds that must be handled knowledgeably. Verdigris that will shift if married to the wrong binder, the stubborn temper of ultramarine that refuses to smooth without patient grinding, lead white that must be kept away from too much sulfur. Many pigments come through apothecary shops, which are themselves regulated spaces with shelves of labeled jars and a scale balanced like justice. The record-keeping is meticulous. A master painter purchases not just supplies but confidence from these purveyors, because a failed mixture is lost money and a botched commission can echo through the city's speech in a way that flattens a reputation faster than any storm. In the shop, you notice that the master's bench is raised slightly. He sits where the light is best, near a window that opens onto the street. He draws. The lines are confident, but he draws because of a contract. Most commissions in this period specify things you might find routine. How many figures, how much or gold, what level of ornament, even how much ultramarine should appear in the robes of the Virgin. Some contracts specify the type of wood for the panel, the width of the frame, the inclusion of a specific saint associated with a patron's name day, all details that seem minor but are strict budgetary decisions. The gold ground shines for God, yes, but it also signals status. Ultramarine costs more than a week's wages, so a strip of that blue announces generosity as much as piety. The city's notaries write these terms under the eyes of witnesses and the soft scratch of quills. If you open the ledger on the bench, you see the master has copied key terms for his own record. Deliver by the feast of a certain saint, penalty for lateness, and the promised fee split in installments so the shop can pay for materials as work advances. A workshop is not a single voice. The journeyman brings a kind of sturdy efficiency to everything he touches. He has probably worked in another city or another shop and carries tricks as much as tools. He can lay bowl and gold leaf with speed, the leaf floating from the pad to the panel so lightly that your eye misses the moment when the dull brown beneath turns to brilliance. He knows where to save time without anyone noticing. Hands and faces will be the master's work, but draperies, columns and patterned carpets can be delegated. This does not mean shortcutting quality. It means the shop breathes like a team whose members sync their tempo to the rhythm of the contract. Outside, Florence's economy hums with similar rules. The city organizes itself through guilds that maintain standards, settle disputes, and present themselves in processions. The Arte della Lana oversees wool cloth production and invests in the great building project of the cathedral as if it were a ledger entry of civic pride. The Arte della Seta, the silk guild, supports a chain of dyers, weavers, and merchants who understand color not as aesthetics but as chemistry, time, and risk because a bad dye ruins expensive thread. Banking families knit it all together with credits and letters that move money across distances with unusual safety for the age. For the painter's shop, this means a client might pay the final installment not in coin, but in a note payable at a counting house, and the master's wife will walk that note to a banker who translates paper into coins, minus a small fee that everyone treats as normal. Notaries appear everywhere. You imagine them in rooms with benches and careful ink lines, writing out agreements that enable people to trust one another in transactions with delayed consequences. The painter's commission is one such agreement, but so is the apprentice's contract and the journeyman's wage. For the apprentice, the contract might include the promise of shoes, a place to sleep, the right to attend mass, and discipline that echoes the language of families rather than corporations. Abuse is not unknown, but the guild offers recourse, and though power flows to masters, a bad reputation can quicken the end of a shop. For the journeyman, the contract is simpler. So much per week, a bonus at delivery, and sometimes a share of the payment when the project is sizable. If you look at the ledger, you find entries like bread for the shop, meat for feast days, oil for lamps in winter, and a note that the apprentice broke a pot and it had to be replaced, the cost noted not to punish, but to maintain a balance that keeps everyone honest. The materials themselves tell long stories. Consider the panel, probably of poplar because it is abundant and stable in this climate. The shop buys boards from a woodworker who joins them with glue and clamps, then season them in a dry place until warping slows. The frame is integral to the panel, carved by a specialist who measures moldings with a patient eye. Gesso is applied in thin layers over rabbit skin glue sizing, each coat an addition to a small mountain of future smoothness. When you run your fingertips over the primed panel, it is cool and strangely warm at once, like a surface ready to be anything. Gold leaf begins as gold beaten so thin it moves at a hint of breath. The bowl beneath the gold is a clay that helps the leaf adhere and adds a slight warmth to the metal's color. Incised patterns and punchwork designs bring light alive in altarpieces, even in rooms that see only a little sun. Pigments move through the shop like characters with their own temperaments. Ultramarine from crushed lapis lazuli arrives as a big cost and is often reserved for parts of a painting whose vibrancy justifies the expense. Azurite offers blue at a lower price, though it will not sing as loudly. Vermilion gives a bright red that can be treacherous if mixed improperly. Lead tin yellow, malachite, verdigris, and a roll of earth colors form a practical palette that looks subdued until the right binder wakes them up. In tempera, egg yolk makes a flexible film. In oil, linseed or walnut oil extends drying time and creates a gloss that might have felt new in this environment when painters from the north brought their habits south. None of this feels like revolution from the bench's vantage. It feels like an incremental solution to a daily problem: how to make a surface carry meaning across years. Clients bring their own calculations. A merchant family might commission an altarpiece to honor a patron saint after a profitable year because gifts to churches echo through the memory of the neighborhood. A widow might order a small devotional picture for a bedroom, choosing a theme associated with consolation. A confraternity might commission a series of panels for a hospital or a hospice where the city's poorest receive care. Each client negotiates size, subject, and cost. The master draws a sketch on parchment for approval, and the client nods or requests changes. Money constrains imagination as much as it enables it. The artist can suggest a new arrangement, a figure, in a different posture, a landscape that opens the scene to a wider world, but the client holds the purse and the deadline. Deadlines matter. They coincide with feasts, weddings, and the dedication of chapels. The city lives by calendars that bundle religious time and civic time into a schedule that the workshops anchor with their own cycles. Watching the shop, you see how the master breaks the work into tasks that fill the weeks: framing, priming, drawing, gilding, painting, and detailing, each part assigned to the person best suited. The apprentice stretches his skills each month. He is allowed to paint some background, foliage, to lay flat colors under the master's later glazes, to assist with the least risky draperies. He learns by repetition and correction. He also learns by errands, carrying letters to clients, fetching supplies, delivering a small picture to a patron's home, and observing how politeness is a tool of trade, as critical as any brush. The city's tax system touches the shop as an invisible hand. When assessors record households, they list the master's assets: his home, his tools, his potential income. The family's dowries are not just family matters, but numbers that affect taxes and future marriages. You can almost see the master's wife at a table with a notebook, calculating with as much care as her husband calculates proportions in a sketch. Her work is daily and mostly unrecorded, paying the baker, managing the household servant. If the family can afford them, negotiating with suppliers who deliver to the door. If the shop has connections to a more powerful family, she knows not to say too much and not to forget names. In a city where reputation is currency, her discretion is part of the business model. Students of history sometimes expect every day in such a workshop to be full of masterpieces. More often it is filled with routine. A banner for a procession uses cheaper cloth and simpler images. A tabernacle painted for a rural chapel might be a repetition of a popular theme, chosen because it is known to please. The master keeps a model book with drawings of heads, hands, draperies in typical folds, halos of different sizes, and decorative motifs that can be combined like a quiet language. Novelty is not a goal by itself. The shop aims at steadiness, clarity, and a feeling of quality that clients recognize as the mark of reliability. Even the great names learned their craft under these rules, copying and adjusting till a personal style revealed itself over time. Competition is steady but not always fierce in the way you might imagine. Shops borrow workers from one another when deadlines press. A carver from a neighboring shop might bring a frame to completion. In time for gilding, a gilder might work. Across multiple workshops, his skill turning dull wood into a field of light in many hands' projects. When large public commissions arise, doors for a baptistery, a chapel cycle in a prestigious church, the process becomes formalized with competitions and committees. Yet the daily bread of most shops comes from medium-sized works that disappear into chapels and homes and become part of the city's landscape so quietly that the shop's routine remains unchanged by headlines. Alongside religious painting, the shop might take on secular work. A wedding chest painted with scenes that signal virtues, a portrait for a merchant's study, a decorative panel for a guild hall. A wedding chest, a caisson, allows the painter to display narrative skill, but again within conventions that clients expect. Mythological scenes that encode advice about marriage, emblems of loyalty and fertility, decorative borders that match fabrics and furniture. The colors here might be brighter, the subject matter freer, yet the process remains an ordered series of steps governed by craft knowledge and delivery dates. Knowledge crosses city boundaries when scribes and merchants carry letters. From the north, rumors of oil painting's advantages circulate among those who mix colors every day. From the east, textiles arrive with patterns that stir a painter's desire to try new arrangements. From local humanists, an interest in antiquity creeps into workshops not as a philosophical challenge, but as an additional storehouse of motifs, a wreath here, a classical column there, a posture borrowed from a sculpture that someone sketched in Rome. The shop absorbs slowly what the century calls new, because change that endures here is change that fits into the schedule and the ledger, that does not frighten clients or destroy margins. Training remains the foundation. The apprentice watches the master lay a drawing with charcoal, fix it lightly, then refine with ink till the general arrangement settles. Pricked patterns might transfer a favored composition to a new panel with pouncing. Underpainting organizes. Values before color comes alive in thin, controlled layers. The apprentice's hand trembles the first time he is trusted with gold. He knows a mistake can be costly. He learns how to burnish just to the threshold of damage, how to cut little patterns with a punch without tearing the leaf, how to keep a breath away so that the gold does not flutter off the gesso's surface. You notice the silence between steps. A great deal of time in the shop is drying time, waiting time, thoughtful time. During those moments, conversations become teaching without drama. The master explains why a client asked for a particular saint. The journeyman explains why a certain varnish must be thin. Someone remarks that a rival shop tried a new pigment that didn't hold its color in the south-facing chapel. These are small lessons that accumulate into a craft tradition, the kind of practical memory that survives because it is useful and repeats without attracting attention. A city official passes by the doorway and stops, peering in. His job is to inspect weights and measures, and perhaps he says nothing more than a greeting, because this is not his jurisdiction today. Still, his presence reminds you how governance for the arts here is administrative more than inspirational. Processions are scheduled, guild memberships checked, taxes assessed, and buildings maintained. The most visible signs of authority are garments and banners, but the real presence is in the routine oversight that keeps standards from drifting and allows commerce to flow. When a shop fails, it often does not fail because the master forgot how to paint. It fails because deadlines slipped, contracts were ignored, or patrons ceased to trust the promises on paper. If you step back into the street, the city hums with a rhythm that matches the shops. Markets operate on certain days. With their own tempo, bells ring the hours, and small courtyards echo with the practical speech of women trading recipes and prices. Men carry rolls of cloth on their shoulders, boys run errands, clergy move with purpose between buildings that anchor neighborhoods. You can sense in this a kind of shared expectation that tomorrow will be like today if everyone keeps their part of the agreement. That expectation is the platform on which the century builds what we remember. And yet there are rumors of changes you cannot quite measure from this doorstep. New ways of organizing space in pictures, new appetites among patrons, new routes that bring different goods and tastes. Standing again before the ledger, you realize how much of this era rests on lines of ink no more dramatic than household lists. The ledger lists expenses and plans, commitments, and small warnings to self. It reminds the master when to buy more size, when to send a polite note to a late payer, when to consider taking an additional apprentice if work continues at this pace. The ledger is the quiet engine that pulls the shop through time. It speaks of survival as much as beauty, of careful choices that keep the door open and the bench busy. You wonder, as the master dips his pen and records another line, whether the everyday bargaining of a dozen rooms like this, so quiet you might pass by without noticing, did more to shape what you think of as the Renaissance than any single grand commission, and if so, what does it mean that nearly all of it survives not in monuments but in the habits of hands and the schedules of ordinary days? You return to the threshold of the workshop just as the bell for prime recedes into the morning. The light has shifted from pale to active, a practical illumination that makes edges sharper and clocks move faster. Today the master has a visitor, the kind of client who sits with the posture of someone used to counting not only coins but also small advantages. He speaks quietly and gestures toward a drawing laid out on a board. You recognize that the negotiation is not about glory. It is about carpentry inches, calendar days, and customary allowances. The dimensions are being measured in braccia and soldi, a dance of units that binds space to money. If the panel grows by a hand's width, the frame must be wider, the gesso must be mixed in greater quantity, the gold leaf must be bought in more packets, and the ultramarine, always the ultramarine, must be justified. The master points to the Virgin's robe in the sketch and nods toward a smaller passage of blue, a compromise that preserves symbol while containing hazards to the ledger. While they speak, you notice how drawing has become the hinge that connects imagination to building. The master's sheet is pricked for transfer, a soft constellation you can only see when the light hits at an angle. The pouncing bag waits nearby, its charcoal dust a bridge between draft and panel. The image you watch is not born in a flash, it is rebuilt through steps that acknowledge error and anticipate correction. He has ruled faint lines across the sheet that converge toward a vanishing point, and although the geometry feels new, it functions as a quiet way of placing furniture and walls so that figures occupy believable space. The talk of revolution that will later surround perspective is absent in this room. Here it is a tool that helps avoid awkwardness. It ensures that a tiled floor agrees with a ceiling and that a table does not float. The truest sign of its value is that the client does not ask about it. Once the agreement is set, the notary's work begins. He writes the stipulations on a clean page, the feast day by which the work must be delivered, the deposit to be paid upon the secure arrival of the panel and frame, the continued payments upon gilding and upon the laying in of the principal. Colors, the final payment upon completion, barring any just cause for delay. A clause lists penalties for late work unless caused by reasons such as illness, war, or an act of God. Another clause notes the inclusion of saints tied to the client's family names, a quiet touch that binds devotion to genealogy. Reading these lines is like watching assurance solidify. You see how contracts replace suspicion with a shared path forward. Even here, in a space that smells of oil and glue, the future is squared off by ink. The work that follows is a procession of tasks you could sort by hours and dampness. Gesso is applied in layers so thin that each one feels like an act of patience rather than painting. Between coats, the apprentice cleans brushes in a basin of warm water, then hangs them bristles down so gravity helps preserve their point. Checks the glue pot as if it were a living creature that needs calm tending. Across the room, the journeyman trims sheets of gold leaf to fit awkward contours along the frame's scrolls. He has practiced the motion so often that his breath synchronizes with the movements of his knife. When he places a sheet onto prepared bowl and breathes across it, the metal settles, adhering like a final word at the end of a sentence. Later, with a burnisher of agate, he will coax a mirror from the thinness. Between these careful motions, other routines carry the shop along. The master's wife returns from the market with bread and onions, perhaps a bit of salted meat for the day after a small advance has arrived. She notes the price variation of oil this week and tucks the number away for later calculation. A neighbor stops by to ask if the master can spare a boy to carry a message to a carver across the river, a polite borrowing that will be repaid in kind. In the corner, a small basket holds scraps of parchment and pieces of charcoal, saved because waste becomes expense when repeated 100 times. Someone refills the sand jar used to sprinkle fresh ink, a domestic detail that keeps pages from smearing. These tiny acts make up most of a day, and in them you can sense the shape of a life that believes constant attention to small things is a better hedge against accident than any grand plan. Because the city turns on shared standards, the workshop keeps a set of references close at hand. A wooden measure marked by the braccio hangs from a nail. A board of common frame profiles leans against the wall, its edges labeled in a careful hand to match patterns customers have learned to recognize as the difference between modest and splendid. A little book with plant and mineral notes stands open near the pigment shelf, with terse reminders that walnut oil yellows less than linseed and that verdigris prefers the company of oil to the sharpness of egg. On another page, there is a list of acceptable substitutes for the last week of the year when shipments run thin: azurite for ultramarine, lead tin yellow for orpiment if the risk of arsenic is not worth the price. The book is not speculation. It is a compendium of choices that made sense when tried under the same light in the same room. Business enters the studio as letters, sometimes sealed with bright wax. A patron from a nearby town asks if the master can prepare a small panel to be sent by mule with spring caravans. A relative writes with the news that a cousin's marriage is set, and there is talk of chests to be painted with scenes borrowed from familiar stories. Measuring these requests against the calendar, the master thinks of weather as a collaborator. Winter air dries slowly and makes gesso temperamental. Summer heat threatens to cure oil too fast and to turn glue into a brief. The downtown workshop is as sensitive to season as any field, except the harvest here is measured in frames delivered and balances struck rather than sheaves gathered. You glance at the apprentice and realize that for him the future is a contract he cannot yet see. At the end of his term, he will attempt to make his own way, perhaps by submitting a piece to the guild for evaluation, perhaps by leaving town for a city where his master's reputation has currency. He will need a patron, a tidy room, and a way to afford good wood for panels. He watches the master negotiate in order to learn how much firmness one can show without losing the job. He watches the journeyman to learn how many pieces a hand can service at once. He watches the city to learn when to speak and when to keep a deferential silence. None of these are taught as lessons. They are absorbed at the same pace that varnish hardens. Beyond the door, the Florentine world shows its own grammar of order and ambition. Large families sponsor chapels and rotate officials into civic roles. The cathedral's dome rises as a civic promise kept, and the trades that supply it hum with regular orders that spill into other shops. Banking houses turn long distances into a series of letters and numbers that your hand can carry in a small packet instead of in a bag of coins. For the workshop, that means payment can be assured with a document rather than with dangerous transport. The master might take a bill of exchange to a counting house where a clerk makes lines of numbers resolve into florins. The shop pays a fee and gains simplicity. In this economy, convenience can be more valuable than a few coins saved, just as in painting a reliable pigment is more valuable than a rare one that misbehaves. Competition between workshops sometimes crystallizes into public contests. Everyone knows the story of competitions for doors, altars, or frescoes, and yet those spectacles sit atop a mountain of quieter contests. Who can deliver before a feast day? Who can reproduce a favored face from memory when a patron wants a resemblance? Who can match a frame profile used in a family chapel 30 years ago, so the new image slips into place as if it had always been there? Reputation grows less from one audacious piece than from the accumulation of these deliverables. Patrons remember who kept promises and who made them nervous. The guild remembers who paid dues on time and who relied too often on excuses. The assistant remembers where days were spent profitably and where they felt wasted. Success here is not a sudden ascent, but a slope climbed by predictable steps. You might expect that this world resists change, but it adapts by putting novelty to work. Oil technique makes its way south, not as a manifesto, but as a slow adoption undertaken by hands that test it on small surfaces. When it proves useful, more flexible blending, a richer shine on draperies, a broader range of glazes, it gets added to the shop's methods when the job allows. Perspective is studied with string and pin around a window frame, not to theorize infinity, but to keep a church interior from looking crooked. Anatomy books appear in humanists' hands and are eventually leafed through by painters who want to make knees and wrists less generic. Little by little, the model book thickens with pages that show new folds and better shadows. Invoices change to include new notes about varnish, preparation, and labor. The city is not in love with novelty. It is in love with what works. Even the changes that startle outsiders present themselves as routine adjustments inside. A wealthy household demands portraits and discovers in this practice a way to make faces part of lineage. The request is absorbed as a new category on the shop's list. A merchant requests a secular panel with ancient heroes behaving like modern examples of prudence and courage, and the shop reaches for stories that have circulated among readers for years. The difference is less in content than in tone. The figures' faces look more like people you might pass in the street. The fabrics fall as if obeying gravity, and the architecture suggests rooms with air you could breathe. The novelty is not radical. It is a better fit with the way eyes and hands recall the world. The operative theme in all of this is reliability. The shop relies on suppliers to deliver clean glue, pure pigment, and wood free from worm. The suppliers rely on the shop to pay promptly and order again. The journeyman relies on the master not to promise more work than the hands in the room can accomplish. The master relies on the journeyman to keep standards at a level that earns repeat clients. The apprentice relies on both to turn his years into competence. The patron relies on the whole chain to convert intention into an object that will stand in a public or private space without embarrassment. This web of expectations is as delicate as gold leaf and as resilient as linen canvas. When it holds, everyone eats. When it tears, reputations fray. With time, you notice something else changing at the edges. Certain names begin to travel on their own, detached from the shop's anonymous steady output. Patrons start to ask not only for a type of picture, but for a specific hand. The workshop can accommodate this by stamping the master's mark more visibly on faces and hands. It can also become a risk because if a client pays for the name, the parts delegated to others must still pass as the master's. This forces the shop to refine its internal school, training a small circle to mimic not just the style but the very habits of brush and proportion. Where once the shop's identity was a brand, now the master's signature becomes its own promise. Outside that promise lies a wider city with its own tensions. Political shifts tilt fortunes. A stern preacher might remind the city that vanity is a moral hazard, and his words can thin the list of commissions that feel ostentatious. In those months, the shop might emphasize devotional works with soberer faces. The rhythm of commissions bends with the city's pulse. After a plague wave, memorials increase and wedding chests wait. After a good wool year, guild halls commission adornments and homes ask for frescoed rooms. The workshop's flexibility is not an artistic choice but a survival strategy, a way of aligning skill with demand in a place where no skill remains valuable if it cannot be adapted. By late afternoon, the day's actions are inscribed in surfaces. The frame gleams with a first burnish. The underdrawing has been reinforced with a light brown ink. A tray of egg tempera sits with discs of color, each labeled with a small mark so that the apprentice remembers which mixture holds more red and which more white. A small test on a scrap panel shows how a glaze deepens when oil is added in a ration known to those who have attempted it a dozen times. The master steps back and judges value relationships with the narrowing eye of someone who has learned that distance is a tool as important as a brush. He says nothing for a long minute and then instructs that a sleeve be slightly darker, that a fold be cut more sharply, that the pupil of an eye be placed a trace lower. These are not grand gestures. They are adjustments that prevent errors later from becoming visible disappointments. Evening brings a closing of windows and the covering of work to protect it from dust. The glue pot is emptied and rinsed, then wiped with a rag that will itself be washed and reused until fibers die. The ledger appears again. Payments are entered, materials are listed. The day's progress is noted with a small phrase that will allow the master, months from now, to reconstruct why a delay occurred or why a certain panel retained its brightness. A line is drawn between personal expenses and shop expenses, a separation that may not be required by law but is enforced by common sense. In this legiscape, clarity is an ethics. It lessens future quarrels and turns memory into something accountable. When you leave the workshop and let the door close, you carry with you the impression that the so-called flowering of art grew less like a sudden bloom and more like a careful cultivation of hardy plants. Water and sun are useful metaphors, but here the real sustenance came from notebooks, scales, and shared expectations. You have watched skill transform raw stuff into images that a city will treat as both holy and ordinary. If perspective allowed, figures to sit comfortably in spaces, and if oil allowed color to breathe, those changes mattered because they made the work smoother, more persuasive, easier to deliver in a way that satisfied many eyes. Yet you wonder, as night comes on, whether the most enduring change inside these rooms was not technical at all, but managerial, a better choreography of people, time, and promises. If that is true, then what you call a revolution might be nothing. More dramatic than an improved method, and if so, what other revolutions pass unnoticed because they travel under the modest name of routine? Morning returns with a patient light, and you find the shop at a stage where the picture begins to breathe. Underpainting has set the values. Color flows in thin films that teach light how to move through drapery and skin. You see the master. Reserve faces for last, not because they are hardest, though they may be, but because they are the place where a hand shows most clearly. A journeyman can bring a robe to completion so skillfully that you might mistake it for the master's, but the subtlety of a cheek or the intention in an eye reveals authorship the way handwriting does. Work proceeds in an order that would puzzle an outsider. Perhaps a background is finished before hands, a halo before hair, a column before a foot. This sequence follows an internal logic born from drying times, risk zones, and the need to keep sleeves or cuffs from smearing a fresh surface. The choreography is precise even when it appears casual. The painting's progress now involves a rhythm of consultation. The client is invited to view the work at a midpoint, the better to adjust. Expectations before the final layers close off easy changes. The master covers portions he doesn't want discussed yet, not as deception, but as a way to focus attention on decisions that still have room to move. The patron nods at likenesses, gestures toward a detail tied to family memory, and repeats, a request made at the contract stage. The master listens and agrees to small changes that do not compromise structure. He knows that a willing ear now prevents quarrels later and ensures the cordial delivery of the last installment. You might imagine that genius chafes at such constraints, yet here a different logic prevails. The most reliable source of freedom is a satisfied client who returns with another commission. Behind the scene, you observe how canvases begin to appear, alongside wooden panels, especially in cities where humidity nags at solid supports. Linen stretched on a frame provides a wider field without the weight and warping of large wood panels. Priming changes accordingly. Glue and gesso combinations can crack on cloth, so mixtures adjust and oils assume a more consistent role. This is not a sudden conversion but a practical widening of method. In Venice, damp air argues loudly for such changes, and the example travels as merchants travel, folded into conversations about other things. A workshop that adapts maintains its calendar, one that does not find itself repairing, joins and apologizing to clients for faults they did not ask to understand. As the 16th century advances, guild structures that once framed a painter's life begin to share space with new organizations. You hear of an academy where drawing is taught as the foundation of the arts, a change in emphasis from inherited craft to codified knowledge. It does not erase the bench and the glue pot, but it introduces a way of thinking about art that stands apart from the grindstone of daily delivery. Young men meet in rooms to sketch from sculpture and from the live model, to discuss proportion with language borrowed from geometry and philosophy. The master of a shop, who learned by repetition and correction under a single roof, now sees some talent splitting their time between the messy floorboards of workshops and the tidier floors of academies. This dual loyalty reshapes expectations. Patrons who once asked only for an altarpiece now sometimes ask for an image composed with learned references, and the price reflects this new currency. Even within churches, the rules for images change, and the workshop adjusts again. After councils meet and speak about the proper function of sacred pictures, contracts decant that guidance into specifics: clarity of story, avoidance of scandal, emphasis on devotion over show. The shop's habits are already aligned with clarity, clear figures, transparent narratives, but additional caution is folded into the process. A certain kind of imaginative freedom narrows, while another kind, rooted in careful composition and persuasive gravity, expands. The journeyman revises a pose to make sure a saint is recognizable from a distance. The master trims ornament where it might distract. The apprentice learns that variety is not the same thing as confusion. The adjustment is not violent. It is a recalibration of values that a competent shop can absorb without drama. Finance changes as much as aesthetics. Where once the city's great banking houses provided the architecture for payments, shifts in fortunes produce periods of uncertainty. The workshop protects itself by diversifying its clients, a monastery here, a confraternity there, a family. Across town, a registrar who needs a commemorative plaque. The ledger becomes a weather instrument as much as a record, showing the barometric pressure of the city's commissions. When one sector thins, another thickens. The master watches the pattern closely, not as a scholar of economics, but as a man responsible for wages and lamp oil. The shop learns to survive by being slightly more ordinary than fashion and slightly more current than habit. In such a climate, names continue to matter in a new way. A signature on a small panel can draw a premium that steadies a month's accounts. The workshop balances the demand for the master's personal hand with the volume required to maintain operations. This balance produces internal systems. A small set of trusted assistants take on certain parts. Cartoons are reused and adapted. Authorized replicas are produced for patrons who want what their neighbor has, with differences small enough to maintain civility and large enough to preserve pride. Model books become formal repositories of parts that can be recombined. You might think this diminishes originality. Inside the shop, it looks like a kit of parts kept alive by alteration, the same way a seamstress transforms familiar patterns, with new fabrics and trims. A turn toward portraiture intensifies the attention to detail that late medieval devotional images already encouraged. Patrons sit for likenesses, and the painter learns to render not just a facial shape, but the softness of a cheek laid down by weather and years. Fabrics become biographies. A sleeve's nap speaks of trade connections. A jewel's cut whispers of a son-in-law in another city. A black garment's depth suggests money that does not need to speak loudly. The sitter's hands become narratives, ink stains for a secretary, roughened knuckles for a man who still counts bales himself, a ring that indicates a marriage's age. None of this is theatrical. It is a catalogue of elements that a careful eye can assemble into a life. The boring details that shape existence, the small enumerations of linen, keys, quills, and beads, migrate into the silent speech of paintings. The workshop's materials shift gradually as routes open and close. A new source of blue enters, the market offering cost without the sea's aura. A red lake made from insect bodies deepens the spectrum. A brown from far forests hums in shadows. But every novelty is tested against durability and compatibility. The master rubs a bit of new color onto a primed scrap and sets it in the window for days, watching for fading. He mixes it with varnish and with oil, with tempera and with nothing, checks for clumping or bleeding. The method is empirical and domestic. No alchemy, just trials controlled by patience. If the pigment passes, it enters the jar line like a hired hand and must prove itself again by working without complaint under heat and cold in a north-facing chapel or a merchant's low-lit office. Time in the shop holds two scales at once. The first scale is daily, small tasks that carry the work forward 1 inch at a time. The second is generational, the way a practice persists beyond a single person. The master thinks about his son or his nephew or a favorite apprentice who might inherit the rent on this space, the client list, the battered but reliable tools, and the ledger with its memory of who pays on time. He rebinds the model book so its pages do not scatter after he is gone. He notes in the margins which clients prefer particular saints and which frames match which chapels. He writes the names of suppliers who were honest. This is not vain immortality. It is the small legacy of competence that keeps a craft from dissolving when a single hand is stilled. Toward evening, you watch the last layers settle. Faces receive their final modeling. The whites of eyes are softened so they do not glare. Lips lose the sharpness that makes paint look like paint. A line of gold on a garment's edge catches a fictive light. A pearl is made with 2 strokes, and a highlight placed with confidence that only practice can provide. The painting is finished not with a flourish, but with a reduction of noise. Excess marks are absorbed. Edges are adjusted where they spoke too loudly. The master says, almost to himself, that too much attention distracts devotion. What remains after this subtraction is what the image was always trying to be. Delivery is uneventful, as it should be. The panel is wrapped against dust and carried by 2 men who have done this often enough to tilt it carefully through narrow streets. At the chapel, the frame is fixed into an existing stone opening with wooden cleats. A small crowd watches as if observing a household task, and perhaps it is. The patron nods in approval. A clerk records the final payment. The workshop returns home with lighter hands and a ledger marked with neat lines that confirm completion. Supper tastes the same as yesterday, only with a little more oil, a quiet celebration that does not risk hubris. When you step away from the scene, the grand story of the Renaissance rearranges itself around these minutes. You see less a parade of geniuses and more a continuity of people doing their jobs at a high level under conditions that reward reliability. Innovations matter because they improved the shop's ability to do what was promised. Patronage matters because it stabilized families and neighborhoods. Guilds matter because they offered a framework within which fairness could be expected and recourse pursued. Even in cities where names blazed brightly, the glow was fed by the disciplined flame of work that thousands of hands kept at the right size and temperature. If this is the true shape of the story, then the lesson is steady and plain. Large cultural shifts ride on small routines. And so you may ask, when you look at the creative industries around you now with their studios, deadlines, invoices, and customer reviews, how different are they from this room with a ledger and a bench? And is the distance between then and now smaller than the dramatic names would have you believe? You begin in a courtyard that looks unremarkable if you pass too fast. A low stone wall, a trough of running water, a pair of wooden vats that smell faintly of wet cloth and warm glue. Rags hang in stiff curtains along rails, white and off-white, stained by former lives as shirts, sheets, and kerchiefs. A man pulls a bundle apart, sorting with that slow authority born of practice. Linen in one pile, hemp in another, cotton in short supply, because imported cotton is prized and holds fibers differently. Wool is avoided, its grease and short staple yield poor pulp. The sorter is the quiet gatekeeper of an economy of paper, deciding which rags will be turned into sheets fine enough for contracts and which will make cheaper stock for shop accounts or rough draft. This is a threshold scene you might overlook, yet here you can feel the hinge on which an entire era swings, paper moving from rare material to practical tool, from precious to plentiful enough to leave traces of ordinary lives. If you step closer, you hear the slap of water-driven hammers striking pulp. The mill's water wheel turns with the stream, transferring its force into a set of heavy wooden stamps that rise and fall, beating the soaked rags into a slurry. It is a rhythm you could listen to and drift to sleep, a dull metronome counting down the transformation of fabric into fiber. The mill workers know when the pulp is ready by feel and by sound, their fingers turning a pinch of slurry, looking for The right balance of long and short fibers. They have learned that patience here becomes reliability later, that poorly beaten pulp creates weak sheets, and weak sheets fray reputations as fast as they fray edges. The vats are kept at a temperature that does not shock the glue that will later size the paper, because extremes breed defects. Everything in this room is a compromise with water and time. On a nearby table sits the mold and decal, the paired wooden frames that will give shape to each sheet. Wires are stretched across the mold surface in a grid. Sewn into that grid is a design bent from wire, a watermark that will reveal itself when the sheet is held to light. These symbols are compact biographies disguised as decorations: a cross, a hand, a ladder, letters, a city emblem, sometimes the initial of a family. They mark origin, quality, and pride in a world where contracts and payments travel farther each year, and where forgery trails trade like a shadow. The vatman dips the mold into the vat, lifts and shakes it just so that fibers settle evenly, then lets the water drain before handing the sheet to the coucher, who lays it down onto a felt. Sheet, felt, sheet, felt, in a stack as high as a child. When the stack is full, it is pressed to squeeze water out, then dismantled so each sheet can meet air. In the drying loft, warm air slips between beams where sheets hang or lie over ropes, the slow breath of a building designed to tame moisture. Here you notice another transformation, this time chemical. After drying, the sheets are dipped in gelatin sizing made from animal offcuts boiled to extract glue. Without this step, ink sinks into the paper and feathering destroys precision. With sizing, ink finds a surface to ride, thin and steady. The smell of hot glue is sharp and domestic, part kitchen, part workshop, a reminder that books and letters share a common craft ancestry with the glue that holds a shoe or a chair together. Sized sheets are dried again, then stacked and pressed. To smooth their faces, the best sheets are remarkably strong, lasting centuries if kept from damp and pests. The worst betray their haste within a year when their sizing cracks and their edges flare. While mill hands work through the cycles, the rag merchants who supply them labor in the narrow streets, ringing bells and calling for old linen. Households know that fabric, once worn too thin for repairs, can be sold. A shirt that keeps someone warm for a decade may spend a last life as part of a ledger page on which a different family's accounts are tallied. You might smile at this mundane ecology, a merchant's fortune recorded on paper made from cloth that once warmed a laborer. But the truth is less neat. Rags carry the rumor of illness, work in rag yards scars hands, and the first step in the process is often boiling and washing to beat back whatever contagion might travel with the fabric. Rag pickers, who collect even what others discard, occupy that low rung in the trade where precariousness is an occupation in itself. Yet without them, the mill's vats sit idle, and without the mill, the city's writing slows. In towns where mills operate, paper is measured and bought in quires and reams, terms that become as familiar as weights of flour or cords of wood. A quire holds 25 sheets by custom in many places, though numbers vary. A ream stacks 20 quires into a unit large enough to bargain over. Stationers, those small shopkeepers who sit between mills and writers, buy by the ream and sell by the quire or single sheets, cutting sizes when a client requests something that fits a pocket or a ledger's dimensions. They know their customers, like bakers know morning regulars. A notary comes in asking for strong paper that takes a firm hand. A student wants cheap sheets for exercises. A merchant's clerk asks for a format to bind into an account book, wide enough for columns, stiff enough to handle daily entries. Each request reflects a way of life that paper makes easier and more precise. Walk into a notary's office and you will find paper has given the room its voice. The notary's hand moves in a practiced script, the strokes economical, the abbreviations learned over years until they become a dialect. He has rules, adjusted by local custom, for recording wills, dowries, contracts, and disputes. Paper lets him work quickly and store his work in bundles tied with string or leather, each bundle labelled at the head. He files copies with city officials, or with guilds as necessary, converting speech into order and transforming promises between people into objects that can be consulted long after voices fade. A single recorded sheet can sway the course of a family's goods a generation later. A bundle of them can prove that a street is wider than a neighbor insists. Paper makes memory portable and negotiable. It also creates work. Clerks maintain indexes, a boring labor that produces miraculous retrievals when someone asks for the record of a promise made on a specific date. In the counting houses, paper takes on a different role. Merchants keep ledgers with pages ruled into columns, debts, credits, balances, notes on exchange rates in other cities, and reminders of maturing obligations. The ink here is thicker, blacker, composed to bite into the sizing without spreading, the better to draw month-long sums and clean lines. Double-entry bookkeeping, which will be written about with pride and suspicion, is in fact an act of self-defense transformed into a discipline. Every number finds its counterpoint. Every outgoing coin finds a recorded trace. The discipline is less an intellectual revolution than the domestication of risk. The men who write in these books do not think themselves philosophers. They think of their nephews in distant places and of the timing of shipments, of storms, of the possibility that a mule goes lame on a pass. Paper becomes the net that catches these variables and lets them be held steady long enough to decide. If you sit in a modest home, paper enters the room as small folded notes, little triangles of news tucked into baskets or slid under doors. A child's copybook lies on a chest, its pages filled with letters practiced again and again. The hand that draws them carries both ambition and obedience. Learning to write is a promise to oneself that the world will be meaningfully countable. In the kitchen, a shopping list written by someone who has taught herself enough letters to remember what to buy on market day sits under a stone. At the church, notices pinned to a door say when a procession will begin or when an auction of a deceased man's tools will take place. The language of paper is not elegant. It is persistent. It turns ordinary time into scheduled time. Before the press, bookmaking is a partnership of crafts gathered under one roof or near one another, parchmenters and paper dealers, scribes, rubricators, illuminators, bookbinders. Paper slowly displaces parchment for segments of the market because it can be made in larger quantities and at lower cost. Not all books embrace it at once. Legal codices, liturgical volumes that must survive generations of use, and prestige. Works continue to be written on parchment, whose skin remembers pressure in a different way and whose status still glows in public spaces. But paper creeps inexorably into texts that need to travel, to be multiplied, to be replaced without ruin. The hybrid book appears, paper for most leaves, parchment for the first and last as a shield of sorts, a nod to durability in a world that expects hands and humidity to test bindings. Travellers carry paper like a second set of eyes. A merchant from one city, moving through another, writes down names and street turns that lead to reliable suppliers. A pilgrim notes miracles and prices. A courtier compiles short phrases, quotations, and verses in a commonplace book. Paper invites this accumulation because it is light and cheap enough not to be a burden. It invites error, too. Lists made in haste mislead. Names are spelled 2 or 3 ways in the same set of pages. Memory corrects in one direction as the ink tries to fix in another. You may think of this as a failing, but it is simply what happens when tools become intimate with bodies. They take on the body's strengths and weaknesses. As paper spreads, it changes how authorities govern because it alters the cost of record keeping. Tax registers grow thicker and more frequent. They capture more people, more objects, more exceptions. Petitions become a genre of civic life. People who, in earlier generations, might have pleaded at a door, now send words that can be read and filed. Ordinances are copied and hung publicly. They do their work by being seen, and then, over time, by being assumed. Guilds require paper trails for apprenticeships and for proof of dues. Courts compile case summaries to speed decisions and secure precedents. The city becomes textured with paper as a fabric becomes textured with stitches, each one small, repetitive, and collectively durable. In the back rooms of monasteries and schools, the coming of paper multiplies exercises. Teachers walk between benches where students bend over grammar texts, copying declensions again and again until the endings line up like familiar patterns. Margins fill with small notes, a sign of struggle that will, over time, become a sign of engaged reading. Students are told to keep lists of words, of rhetorical figures, of proverbs. The material cost of these notes is small compared to parchment, so the intellectual cost of experimentation drops. You see a new kind of thought that is not chained to remembering, a thought confident that it can be rebuilt from notes. It is not brilliance. It is routine plus time. Meanwhile, in quiet corners of cities where trade hums and travellers talk, a different use of paper grows, the newsletter. Before the broadside and the printed sheet become common, people hire or befriend men who send them periodic reports, prices of pepper and woad, rumours of war, the health of princes, the weather on the Bay of Biscay, whether the road between 2 towns is safe. These reports move behind the obvious commerce, travelling on the same mules and ships that carry cloth and grain. They are copied by hand because the audience is small and specific. A good reporter earns his pay by being dull and accurate. He repeats known things with care, adding just enough of the uncertain to make his client feel prepared. His paper may be folded with the same crease, the seal, placed in the same spot, a ritual that tells the reader that he is still connected to a predictable stream. Even the post that carries these papers is a patchwork of arrangements, family firms, guild networks, and public roads. Paper interacts with this world by making schedules necessary. A letter sent on Monday should arrive by Friday if weather holds. Messengers learn to write brief delivery notes as receipts. Inns keep registers of bags left and bags collected. Everything is held together by the belief that writing something down reduces the chance of misunderstanding, and by the reality that misunderstandings still arise and must be corrected by writing again. The stationer who sells paper also sells ink and pens. He mixes iron gall ink by steeping oak galls crushed to powder with vinegar and adding iron salts and gum. The ink eats slightly into the sizing and oxidizes over time into a deep brown black. He sells reed pens and, more often, quills from geese, and swans cut to fit a hand and renewed frequently. This small economics of writing implement supports an architecture of writing habits. People learn how often to sharpen, how long to let ink dry before folding. Some sprinkle sand over pages to speed drying. Others blow carefully across the words. A few forget and smear their effort. A blot becomes a family joke repeated at meals. You might expect the paper immediately displaces older materials, but wood tablets coated with wax persist for drafts and for calculations that will be erased. Chalkboards exist where numbers need to move quickly. The language of writing is layered like a wall with many coats of paint. New layers do not obliterate old ones. They absorb and show them in certain light. In an age you have been told is about rebirth, it matters to see how domestic the changes are. They creep rather than shout. They settle rather than replace. They create new routines rather than destroy old ones. At the threshold of the next shift, you can feel a pressure gathering without yet hearing its machinery. In the corners of certain shops, block books appear, short, cheap volumes printed from woodblocks that carry both text and image. On single carved pages, they are labor-saving devices for specific markets, alphabet books for children, devotional images with familiar prayers for those who like words that match woodcuts. They begin to teach people that pages can be multiplied beyond the speed of a scribe's hand. A few entrepreneurs stand between the stationer and the scribe, imagining a space where words will be poured into forms rather than written. The rag merchant does not yet notice the millers beat their pulp as they always have, the notary writes in his practiced hand. But you, standing where air smells of glue and damp linen, can sense that the same cheapness and sameness that made paper irresistible to the daily life of a city will soon make some other tool irresistible to those who want to pour language faster. And if speed and sameness settle into reading routines, how will the quiet rooms of writing adjust to the noise? The pages arriving multiple at a time, you return to the threshold of the stationer's shop at the precise moment when a new sound enters the city's routines. It is heavier than the slap of rag hammers and more rhythmic than the murmur of clerks. It is the push and release of a book press, the thud of platen against tympan, the soft hiss of dampened paper peeled from a form. If you step inside the printer's room, you see that the furniture of this craft looks like a carpenter's domain interrupted by letters. A bench holds molds for casting type, a furnace, glossed with soot, warms metal, and beyond that the press stands like a well-behaved machine that prefers being kept clean. Nothing here announces revolution. What you witness is a controlled multiplication of gestures you already know: writing, reading, filing, wrapping, and delivering. Only now those gestures occur faster and with greater sameness, and sameness, you realize, is its own quiet power. The press itself is simple to your sight and complicated in its practice. A wooden frame supports a bed on which a form sits, locked, type arranged to create a page. Above is a platen that will descend to press paper onto inked letters. The pressman works with ink balls, leather or skin stuffed with wool, dabbed in a sticky black that grips type without pooling. He beats the ink onto the raised letters with a practiced dance, his strokes overlapping so that no letter goes hungry. A damp sheet, prepared the night before in stacks to make the fibers flexible, is laid onto the tympan and protected by a frisket that reveals only the print area. The bed is rolled under the platen. A screw, turned by a bar, brings pressure down. Then the pressman pulls the bar with a decisive move. Pressure transfers ink to paper. The bed is rolled out. The sheet is lifted and hung to dry, and the sequence repeats. Each part of this cycle has a speed that does not change quickly, and that constancy defines the shop's output as reliably as any clock. The type that forms words is a city of little metals. Letters are cast from an alloy that balances hardness and resilience, the better to withstand thousands of impressions before they break or fatten under pressure. A punch cutter cuts a letter into steel, makes a punch. That punch strikes a softer matrix, and into this the caster pours molten metal in a hand mold held with long practice. The result is a single letter of consistent height and a body that can mate with its neighbors. This prehistory of every printed word is invisible when you read, Yet it is the labor that creates legibility and speed. A good set of type becomes a shop's quiet treasure. A broken or worn set becomes slow leaks in quality and time. Compositors work at a pair of cases, the upper with capitals, the lower with common letters, each compartment sized to fit a letter's frequency. They set type into a composing stick, a frame they hold in the left hand while plucking letters with the right, building lines backward so the final text prints forward. The compositor knows the spellings and abbreviations favored by the market and the printer, adjusts spacing to justify lines, and drops completed lines into a galley. He, or sometimes she in family shops, works with a steady pace that balances speed against errors. An error is a cost with a ripple. A wrong letter seeds a correction process, a stop to the press if discovered late, a note for an errata slip if discovered far too late. The printer who avoids errors gains more than pride. He gains the trust of clients who value books that do not embarrass them in rooms where quiet knowledge confers advantage. Printing begins with a job, and jobs arrive as manuscripts, letters of privilege, indulgence forms, calendars, school texts, devotional books, almanacs, and increasingly small pamphlets that make arguments or announce events. The printer reads the manuscript not as a scholar but as a manager. How many pages, what format, how many copies, what paper quality, what type size will satisfy the client and his readers. He calculates imposition, how to arrange pages on a sheet so that when folded and gathered in signatures, the sequence runs neatly. He chooses a format, folio for authority and expense, quarto for a balanced compromise, octavo for portability, and thrift. The job is broken into form, is set, proofed by a corrector who marks errors in a brisk script, reset where necessary, and then run in batches. Skins of ink are mixed and tested. Damp stacks of paper pass from pile to pile like bread dough in a bakery. Much of it is routine. Repetition builds the shop's hum. In cities where printers gather, book fairs anchor the calendar. Printers send piles of fresh sheets wrapped in paper and tied with cord to traveling agents who carry them to market towns where stationers and booksellers meet. There, orders are taken, debts settled, remainders bargain-priced. A fair is a place where sameness reveals its strength. A printer who can supply a school with the same grammar book year after year becomes part of the school's infrastructure. The teacher learns to cite page numbers that will match the pupils' books. The pupils learn that their notes will map to future editions. Printers become partners in the stability of memory, and in that stability the printing trade finds its unromantic dignity. In many places, a printer's privilege or license defines what is publishable, and this regulation too moves on paper. A petition is submitted, an approval is written, a copy is deposited with an authority, a notice is printed to warn rivals. Not to pirate the edition. The law is no secret in this economy. It is an agreement about who may take the risk of scheduling pressed hours to produce 1,000 copies of something. Piracy exists, as it always does, when sameness can be imitated, but community norms and local enforcement keep much of the trade stable. A printer who copies another's new edition too quickly finds himself frozen out of the reciprocal network that moves sheets and updates prices. In most weeks, the dull gravity of mutual benefit holds everyone in orbit. The products that flow out of presses are not all grand codices. Broadsides announce processions, lost objects, new taxes, and births in prominent families. Forms make administration life easier. Printed indulgence blanks await names and dates. Bills of lading carry printed headings to be filled by a clerk's hand. Lottery tickets carry numbers ready to be trusted because their uniformity comforts suspicion. Almanacs offer calendars of feasts, phases of the moon, advice on when to plant and when to bleed. a mix of law and schedule that ties sky and field into one sheet posted on a wall. Cheap song sheets appear on corners, enabling even those who cannot read to join a tune by following the crowd. None of these items claim immortality, yet they weave themselves into daily hours in ways that parchment never could, because parchment could not be made so cheaply and quickly. A print shop's workforce divides along tasks that become habitual, identities. Pressmen develop arms that understand the feel of perfect pressure. Compositors cultivate eyes that see spacing problems at a glance. Correctors grow pedantic in a way that earns eye rolls and respect. Apprentices sweep, dampen paper, turn the heap so sheets dry evenly, run errands, and, after a year or two, set type for small jobs. Wives and daughters sew wrappers, fold sheets, bind pamphlets with coarse stitches, and fill the house with the dusty scent of paper and ink that cling to clothes and hair. Metal workers attach the shop to a world of furnaces and files. Paper dealers and rag merchants tie it to mills and alleys. Stationers connect it to reading rooms and lecture benches. If you stand in the doorway long enough, you can feel the trade's dependence on a chain of unglamorous reliabilities: a consistent paper size, a fair price for lampblack and oil, a team that shows up and performs their part without fuss. Reading habits adjust gradually. The noise of public reading continues in churches and courts, but the private pace of eye moving silently from word to word becomes more common. Margins grow. People write more notes in the blank space around printed words. They argue with an author by adding a little finger pointing at a sentence and a word in the local tongue that sums up their reaction. Books become collections of paper with spaces that invite other hands. Blank books fill with accounts, recipes, letters copied for the practice of style, and excerpts of things overheard that felt worth keeping. Paper is not just a medium for fixed words, it is a workshop for thoughts that are not yet fixed. Schools profit from the new rhythm. Teachers can assign the same text and expect students to look at the same line. Errors in one printing are corrected in another, and teachers pass along the improvements through ordinary conversation. The price of a basic grammar decreases enough that a careful family can buy a copy for a child to take home. The home itself becomes a small library, even if it holds only a few items: a devotional book, an almanac, a grammar, perhaps a thin collection of tales. Each item has a place on a shelf or in a chest, but their true place is the mind's expectation that a question can be answered by consulting paper rather than by consulting a neighbor. Social trust shifts slightly from the face you know to the type you can recognize. Printers' marks begin to appear on title pages, small emblems that function as brands and assurances of competence. A device might be an anchor, a dolphin, a pair of compasses, a star, initials intertwined with a tool. For the reader, it tells a story of where the book was made and by whom. For the printer, it signals pride and warns rivals that identity matters. Printers learn that the look of a page, its typeface, its margins, its ornaments, communicates as much as its words. A handsome page is not opulence for its own sake, it is a sign that care has been taken, which readers translate into trust. Uniformity becomes a form of courtesy. Errors persist, and the shop evolves methods to manage them. A first sheet is pulled and read by a corrector, who marks changes with standardized symbols. The compositor resets a line or a paragraph. The form is locked again. Another proof is pulled. When a mistake survives into the run, an errata, slip, is printed. Small, apologetic, practical. Books abound with the slip inserted, and careful readers paste it at the back for permanent memory. Nothing in this process attempts perfection in the modern sense. The aim is adequacy amplified by stability. The printer who finds and fixes the errors most efficiently wins. Authorities watch with ambivalence. Printing helps them circulate laws, widely and cheaply, a power they appreciate. Printing also makes possible the quick spread of arguments they dislike. Their response settles into a management routine, privilege systems and pre-publication approvals, post-publication punishments when lines are crossed, occasional destruction of certain editions, periodic reminders of limits. In return, printers behave like any trade. They learn how to navigate the wind, how to adjust sails, how to move around obstacles without wrecking the hull. Most of the time they print what sells and what offends least, because the cost of paper and wages continues whether or not the press is pulling. Meanwhile, in the quieter rooms of households, paper continues to occupy modest roles that change, lives in small increments. A grandmother copies a recipe so her daughter will not forget the ratio of nuts to honey. A young man writes down the exact phrasing of a prayer that comforts him at night. A shopkeeper builds a price book with columns that let him spot patterns in his own business he never saw when numbers sat only in memory. The dull format of a ruled page teaches the eye to compare. Comparison teaches the mind to infer. Inferences map onto choices made the next day at market. Boring, you think, and yet the line that connects this boredom to prosperity is short. You smell the press's ink in your hair as you leave, and you understand that the romance of the press was always built on unwashed hands doing repeatable tasks. If paper made writing more domestic, printing made reading more predictable. It did so by turning stubborn material into a reliable partner, fiber into sheet, sheet into page, page into habit. The old worlds of voice and memory survived, but now they shared rooms with a device that could pour words like grain into sacks. When sacks arrive on schedule, bakers bake more bread. When books arrive on schedule, schools teach more pupils. If you follow this thought into the next room, you can't help but ask, as sameness multiplies, does the value of difference increase or decline, and is the balance between these two the real engine that drives an age forward under the quiet contract of routine? You return on a day when the printer has a different kind of job, one that stretches the shop's network outward. A scholar has prepared a new edition of a text that others have copied by hand for generations. He brings not just words, but expectations, notes, in the margin a request for clear headings, an index, and a promise that, if done well, more scholars will gravitate to this shop. This is not a mass market job, it is a prestige piece that must persuade specialists. The printer balances vanity and viability. He knows that spending too much time on a book with a small audience could make him miss a larger job. He also knows that the right association earns future work. The calculus resolves itself into a familiar compromise. The scholar pays for certain extras, the printer invests in tidier type and wider margins, and both accept a production schedule that keeps the press pulling on other jobs between gatherings. This book reveals another layer of paper's quiet influence. Organization. The compositor sets headings in a larger type. The pressman prints running titles at the top of pages. An index is compiled by a careful hand that flips between topics and page numbers. The index may be flawed, but its very existence changes. How a reader engages, he can glance, search, and skip, and in those motions a new posture of reading is born, less linear, more selective, more confident that retrieval is possible. The scholar's correction lists are gathered into an errata that reads like a confession without shame. Everyone understands that speed and scope bring errors, and that the answer to such errors is not retreat but better habits. In the same week, the shop prints indulgence forms, a task that pays quickly and uses standard templates kept in a drawer. The forms are printed on narrow strips to save paper. Names and sums are filled in by hand. A traveller collects a stack and departs to sell them. You might be tempted to see this as impersonal, but to the buyer, the uniformity comforts. If the indulgence looks like the one his neighbor bought, he trusts the arrangement. In many cities, religious life and paper life overlap in such forms. Brotherhoods keep lists of members' dues and obligations. Hospitals maintain rolls of donors and patients. Parishes record baptisms and marriages on registers that would be unimaginable without cheap paper. The sacramental and the administrative meet on the line where a name is written. A change in materials shows up in the binding room. Paper becomes not only the leaf, but the cover. Limp paper bindings secure thin pamphlets inexpensively. Boards are covered in printed waste from older projects, a recycling that wraps words inside words. People who buy books begin to expect that they can afford them unbound and have them dressed later by a binder to match their shelf. The shelf, in turn, becomes an emblem of a household's kinds of attention. Law books in one block, theology in another, poetry and tales in a lighter corner, ledgers and almanacs nearer the desk. The act of arranging books codifies the act of arranging thoughts, and that codification in some houses becomes a daily pleasure, as soothing as folding linen. You travel in your mind along the routes that carry these sheets. A merchant's letter instructs a clerk to buy 20 copies of a grammar for a school to be shipped with bolts of cloth. A mule packer knows to tie the bundle in a way that protects edges from rubbing. He has a habit of turning the packets each morning so weight rests on a new side, an easy adjustment that prevents warping. At an inn, a packet rests near the stove, but not too close, because heat can curl damp sheets into stubborn curves. The innkeeper knows to keep books out of the path of draughts because nights condense moisture on cold surfaces. This knowledge is not high law, it is housekeeping applied to paper. These small courtesies keep pages flat and ink clear months after they left the press. Filter down to the smallest uses and you find paper remaking routines you would otherwise call wordless. A midwife keeps a tally of births and keeps a private list ordered by streets so she can estimate where she will be needed next. A mason sketches a wall's profile on a scrap to show a client how the new course will sit. A weaver draws a simple diagram of a pattern so he can reproduce it next season, without asking memory to do everything. These scraps usually do not survive. They are thrown into baskets, burned for heat, or tucked into a wall and sealed by plaster. Yet their invisibility does not reduce their effect. They train hands to expect that a piece of paper can hold a problem steady and then disappear when the problem is solved. The press also extends the reach of images. Woodcuts, set alongside type, provide pictures of saints, diagrams of instruments, maps of regions, and patterns for embroidery. The woodcut is a labor-intensive cousin to type, a picture carved in relief, inked and printed with the text. Copperplate. Engravings will arrive later with their fine lines and separate presses, but here, in this era, wood's grain and the block's durability shape what images look like. The printed image is uniform in a way that a painted image cannot be. A mother can buy a small print and paste it near a bed as a focus for prayer. A school can buy diagrams of geometry or anatomy and know that every pupil looks at the same lines. Images stop being purely local when a block travels or when its impressions travel, and this sameness is a lesson. The world widens without losing its shape. Censorship expands with images too. Authorities worry not only about words, but about pictures that skirt the edge of propriety or doctrine. Printers learn which kinds of woodcuts invite attention and which pass without comment. They cultivate a vocabulary of ornament and allegory that satisfies the eye without exciting the censor. In every town there are lists of band titles, some kept by officials, some kept informally by printers who prefer not to test boundaries. Even so, the boundaries, like fences in fields, are adjustable. A printer notes that a neighbor in another City printed a certain book without trouble. He asks a traveller whether the climate there is milder. If the wind seems favourable, he sets type. The cost of error rises with speed, so the shop develops many little safeguards. The dampening crew counts sheets aloud to avoid misplacing or misnumbering gatherings. The compositor keeps a paper slip near the stick to note tricky spellings so he won't vary them by habit. The pressman checks the ink balls for grit that can scratch a block or type as a single scratch repeats itself down a stack like a stutter that becomes a speech impediment. When a former is disassembled, the type returns to their cases after a quick washing in lye. The liquid smells harsh, hands redden, skin cracks in winter. These are the small costs of uniformity, paid by workers whose names rarely enter the record. Literacy tilts. You might assume that more books mean more readers, and eventually that is true, but for a time the biggest change is that readers read more. A clerk who already reads now reads faster and wider because texts pile up where they used to trickle. He shares summaries with neighbours who still prefer listening. A school teacher reads aloud from a printed text and students copy. A merchant dictates letters to a scribe who uses printed forms as a guide, so that even the voice of the illiterate travels in printed channels. Literacy expands at the edges through partial skills, enough to recognize a name, enough to catch a price, enough to stumble through a familiar prayer. Paper lowers the barriers to such partiality and makes it useful. A few people begin to complain about the noise, too many books, too many pamphlets, too many opinions. Their complaint is itself a sign of the new world, where scarcity once made every book notable, abundance makes discrimination necessary. People start choosing. They build habits to filter, trusted printers, trusted teachers, trusted lists. The anxiety that accompanies choice has its own dull routine. A father asks a teacher which texts to buy. A guild prints a list of approved manuals. A convent keeps a catalogue that notes which books are kept in the refectory and which in the library. Catalogues become bridges over the river of print. Walking them is safe and repeatable. Outside the shop, two boys tie waste paper into packets and sell them to a local baker for kindling. Printed words become fire, heat leaches their meanings, and someone warms hands over a paragraph that argued for a precise point 2 months ago. You are tempted to think of this as tragic, but the boys see only fuel, and in their eyes you glimpse another truth. Printing made possible a world in which words are strong enough to survive both burning and indifference. Unless you stand in a melancholic corner, you will see that such strength is new, and, because it is distributed across thousands of rooms, curiously comforting. At dusk, the printer's wife writes a short note to a paper dealer reminding him that a delivery is expected in 2 days. She uses a stub of pencil, graphite wrapped in string, to jot it, and then traces the lines in ink. She folds the paper, heats a little wax, seals it, and hands it to an apprentice who knows the route. The whole scene is undramatic. It exemplifies a deeper issuance. Paper and print took on the role once reserved for miracle in some stories. They made coordination at a distance possible without surprise. Letters replaced providence for many tasks, and so the city leaned more of its weight on these fibers and inks, until the fibers and inks became as normal as clay and straw. When you step back from all this and take a slow breath, you notice a new modesty in timekeeping. Calendars hanging on walls do not just count days, they coordinate many lives at once. A ferry schedule, written on a board with chalk and then copied onto paper notices for distant inns, makes departures into promises. A court day announced by broadsides makes justice into an event that can be prepared for rather than guessed at. Paper and print pushed the city out of a seasonal vagueness into a mesh of small expectations. It was not sudden, it was not glorious. It was not even widely remarked in the language of heroes. It simply settled into place until no one could imagine arranging marriages, harvests, payments, lessons, and prayers without a strip of paper pinned to a post. If all of that is true, you might ask, as night hush rises over the shop and the last sheets dry on cords, when sameness makes everything easier to plan, does surprise become more valuable or more frightening? And how do people decide which kind of life they prefer when the choice is hidden inside the ordinary act of turning a page? You stand in a square before dawn when the city smells like bread that is not yet bread. Flour dust floats in the air. The ovens are hot enough to make their own weather. The baker's doors are open to let heat escape, and you feel the damp night turn crisp as it passes the threshold. A man in a flour-stiff apron turns dough in long troughs, adding water from a measured bucket, sprinkling salt by weight, not by feel, because this is a regulated craft. The city does not trust hunger to chance. It appoints officers to watch grain supplies and to make sure the weight of a loaf corresponds to the price set each week. The rules are dull and relentless. If grain is dear, the loaf weighs less for the same coin. If grain is plentiful, the loaf grows generous. These rules form the anatomy of daily survival. The Bakers' Guild organizes itself around ovens that never fully cool. Members agree on standards, apprentices learn ratios by muscle memory, and the guild cooperates with city officers who test weights and measures. Standardized stones sit on counters for comparison, and scales are checked regularly by men with lists who perform the same motions on the same days each month. A baker's ledger records sacks of grain received, bran set aside for animal feed, the sale of yesterday's stale loaves at a discount to frugal households, and the loss of a batch because a fire went too low during the second watch. Nothing. Here is art. Everything here is craft impressed into service by hunger's quiet insistence. Grain arrives by cart, by barge, by mule. Its route traces the city's dependence on lands beyond its walls. Officers known by their local titles, a board of abundance, a grain office, keep registers of expected shipments and of what is actually delivered. When a year runs dry, grain must be bought from further away, risks multiply, and the cost of carriage appears as lines in the city's accounts. The city's leaders have learned that famine breeds anger quickly. To prevent disorder, they maintain reserves in granaries whose doors open only by public order. Keys are kept by more than one person, and the ritual of opening is conducted with witnesses. This is dull theatre that keeps crowds from believing that favoritism governs essential goods. If you drift through a market after sunrise, you see the logic of the bread scale applied elsewhere. Butchers hang meat in an order, learned through years. Less perishable cuts closer to shade, more perishable sold first, offal early in the morning to those who know how to turn it into soup and sausage. Fish arrives on schedules dictated by rivers and tides. A city learns to translate weather into menus. Olive oil is rationed in small households. Vinegar stretches flavor and helps preserve. Cheese travels better than fresh milk. Curds become a way to carry pasture into narrow streets. These habits smooth the rough edges of uncertainty. They are not romantic. They are respectable routines. On the other side of the square, a pawn bank opens its shutters, the Monte di Pietà, or its cousin, by another name. Here, a woman exchanges a cloak for a small loan to cover rent during a sickness. A craftsman leaves a tool for a few coins until his client pays. A man in a hat negotiates a rate that undercuts the harsher terms of private lenders. The pawn bank keeps careful records, tickets with numbers, descriptions, dates, interest schedule. The morality of lending is argued by theologians elsewhere. At this counter, pragmatism defends itself by reducing desperation. The pawn bank see Ledger contributes to the city's survival by turning goods into buffer against the spiky line of a year's fortune. In a hospital courtyard, a porter sweeps, and you might not notice him because your eye is drawn to arches and cloisters. But the porter is the hospital's front line against contagion and confusion. He directs arrivals to the right ward, keeps a daily count of beds occupied, and notes in a book who arrived with whom, because visitors can carry both comfort and disease. Hospitals range from small houses for the sick poor to large complexes that treat injuries, fevers, and the discomforts of age. Nurses change linens, wash floors with vinegar water, and keep a chalk tally on a wall of how much bread and broth to send to each ward at mid-morning. The hospital's survival depends on predictable donations and on a city's willingness to see charity not as a burst of emotion, but as a scheduled activity. City ledgers, tax registers, and lists of residents capture people as entries that sometimes feel less human than they are. The tax office records names, addresses, household members, assets, debts, and the value of dowries that pass from family to family as if they were small barges shuttling across canals. The dowry is a private concern made public by the city's need to measure wealth for fairness in taxation and security in marriage contracts. The numbers have consequences. They determine who is eligible for certain offices and how much a family contributes to public works. The city sets thresholds not to judge souls, but to balance payments. You see the hand of a scribe that has copied the same form so often that the letters move like a modest song. In many neighborhoods, a confraternity organizes practical piety. Members agree to attend funerals, to carry a litter with dignity, to raise money for a dowry for a poor girl, to visit prisoners, to deliver wood in winter to houses where cold bites. They wear simple hoods or badges and keep minutes that read like the minutes of any association. Who attended, who was excused, how much was spent on bread at the last funeral, whether the procession will start at the second bell or the third. Their work stitches the city's moral fabric to its economic fabric by making sure that rituals of care are not left to accident. When plague comes, these groups become the skeleton of a response that can be built quickly and then, with sorrow, repeated. Water shapes health. Wells are mapped by neighborhoods. Fountainheads are maintained by officials who test flow and watch for theft from conduits that feed fountains. Cisterns are cleaned on a schedule, and fines are levied for throwing refuse, where water must remain clear. In some places, water carriers make daily rounds, selling at a price that depends on distance from fountains and the gradient of streets. Household waste leaves by narrow channels, and in many towns, night soil collectors follow their own routes, practiced and discreet. This management is not sanitary by modern measures, but it is the best the city knows, and it depends on a bureaucracy of minor officials who keep lists and issue warnings so often that their names never rise to public attention. You pass the Office of Weights and Measures, where inspectors keep master units locked in a cabinet. They travel markets with a rod and a set of stones and perform their ritual checks. An unfixed scale earns a fine. 2 such fines in a month earn a suspension. Repeated offences earn the loss of a license to trade. The office records their round, with tidy columns, date, place, offender, offence, penalty, collected or pending. The banality protects buyers and sellers alike. It prevents the slow erosion of trust that inflates prices through suspicion. Boredom is the insurance policy here. The night watch is a civic habit that depends on mutual expectation. Men take turns, according to lists posted in the ward, to patrol with lanterns and staves. They report fires, disturbances, and open doors. They are neither soldiers nor spies. They are neighbors with an official duty that breaks the temptation to think only of one's own safety. They carry whistles and know which corners catch the wind. The watch captain writes a short note at dawn of all that happened. Most mornings the note lists nothing, and that nothing, repeated for weeks, constitutes security. Sumptuary laws seem trivial until you understand their place in this economy. The city limits certain displays of cloth and jewels, not out of petty cruelty, but to temper the competitive urge that can push households into ruinous expense. Inspectors attend weddings and feast days, not to humiliate but to enforce a community's decision about the level of display it can sustain without inflaming resentment. Enforcement is inconsistent. Exceptions are granted to celebrate public victories. The ledger of fines collected reads like a gossip column, but the deeper reason for this regulation is the preservation of the city's sense that wealth can be displayed without becoming unbearable. The line is arbitrary, the practice is routine. The corners of houses, granaries inside walls, store family grain like a private hedge against lean weather. Keys hang from dowry chests. Women manage inventories. A note on the inside of a chest's lid records the last time a store was aired. Mice pry, cats patrol. The household, like the city, learns that storage is as much a discipline as acquisition. Treaties that bring grain by sea or river exist in law books, but their success depends on the mundane steadiness of those who sweep granaries and turn sacks. Behind all of this is a tax system that annoys everyone and yet keeps the city from falling apart. Taxes protect walls, pave streets, pay for night watch, maintain fountains, and fund charity. They are assessed imperfectly and collected imperfectly. People complain and petition. Officials adjust rates and issue amnesties. Petitions pile in. Bundles tied with string. A clerk nods at the pile. He has read it all before. He knows the city will collect enough to survive because it always has. There is a fatalism here that is also a practicality. Life continues because routines continue. At the end of the day, a baker's daughter brings a stale loaf to a neighbor who has been ill. She does this without instruction because the habit of small kindness repeated becomes the city's unwritten code. It restates all the above in softer terms. Weights and measures matter, so does sharing. Granaries protect the city, so does a bowl of soup carried upstairs. Regulations stabilize markets, so does the quiet note written by a neighbor, alerting a confraternity that a funeral will be needed soon for a woman alone. In this world, survival is the arithmetic sum of 1,000 routines and 100 pieces of paper. The bell for Compline lingers, and you step back into a street cleaned by cool air. You have watched how bread and ledgers interface, how weight and ink make each other meaningful, how charity walks on legs made sturdy by schedules. You might believe that crisis, when it comes, will smash these routines to pieces. The people who live here know a different truth. Crisis will test routines and then, in the ruins, ask them to be rebuilt. The question you carry as you walk away is simple. How do you rehearse for a disaster that always arrives in a slightly different costume? And which of these quiet habits will prove most elastic when plague returns with its own timetable? You find yourself at the gate of a lazaretto, the low island of buildings set apart from the city like a sentence set off by commas. Here, quarantine acquires walls and a schedule. Boats that arrive from places where disease is rumored must stop. Goods are aired, passengers are observed. The officers at the gate have lists. Ships expected, ships arrived, cargo declared, days required for airing. The number 40 reappears often, a habit turned into a rule by a mixture of theology, medicine, and experience. Quarantine does not come from certainty about disease. It comes from wary observation that time can defeat contagion as work defeats. Mud on a boot. Inside, bales of wool are unrolled and hung. Spices are spread thin. Letters are pierced and smoked. Fabric is beaten with switches to shake out invisible dangers. The processes feel medieval because they are, and yet they persist because time and repetition taught the city that some work reduces risk. The lazaretto keeper maintains registers of goods and people with an orderly script that betrays no fear. He knows the value of his calm. If panic enters here, the city outside takes damage that lasts longer than any plague. The lazaretto's schedule becomes a comfort. Day 2, the same rituals. Day 13, an inspection. Day 29, a final airing. Day 40, release if no symptoms appear. The boredom of these numbers sits like a shield between city and sickness. Within the city, health boards assemble. One room holds physicians who read the pulse of neighborhoods. Another holds notaries who convert stories into orders. The orders are prosaic: keep houses closed where disease is, limit gatherings, assign nurses to certain wards, ensure the dead are buried swiftly with respect, regulate funerals to prevent crowds, boil straw from sickbeds, whitewash walls with lime. Carters are assigned to carry the sick. Their names are recorded. Their pay is agreed in advance to prevent haggling under stress. A network of courtyards and streets becomes a schedule pinned to the wall. The bravery celebrated later belongs not to heroes, but to people willing to show up to this schedule. Doctors visit houses with a measured expression. They carry a written report for the board, not because the report cures anyone, but because without the report the city cannot act. They are careful about what they promise. Some bring remedies, others bring instructions. All of them bring the authority of the city's attention. The city wishes to be seen caring for its members. That care expresses itself in lists of bedding, distributed bread and wine provided, and the closing of schools for a set period. The measure of success is not stated but shared. If fewer houses hang black cloth at doors, if more ovens light at dawn, then routines resume. The Book of Deaths, kept by parish or by special office, marks numbers with the same hand that wrote numbers in calmer years. The likeness is reassuring. Burial customs adjust, not to deny grief, but to keep it brief. Bodies are wrapped and carried without wakes in times of contagion. The confraternities still walk, but their pace accelerates, and their routes change to avoid narrow lanes where crowds gather. Cemeteries fill. New ground is consecrated. Little crosses mark rows that will become anonymous. The registers record names and streets, ages when known, and sometimes occupations. The entries shrink, the handwriting rushes and then steadies. In the margins, a clerk adds a line: rain today, trenches slippery. Such details are dull, but they anchor memory in the facts of effort. And in the end, this is how a city keeps from dissolving in sorrow, by advancing work that gives shape to loss. Plague does not erase hunger, and so the bread routine tries to hold. Grain officers move reserves carefully, mindful that crowds at granary doors breed more danger. They arrange for neighborhood distribution by stewards who know the families and can hand out loaves without spectacle. The assize of bread adjusts, weekly by written notice pinned to market posts. Bakers continue under watch. Their guild provides lists of who is still working so the city can plan for shortages and assign apprentices where masters have died. When the guild meets, the minutes list the names of the dead with a plainness that feels like stone. Then they proceed to business. How many sacks remain? Which oven needs repair? Who will take in the orphaned apprentice and finish his term? Mourning is a duty, but it is not the only duty. The hospitals turn from their daily regimen to a stricter isolation. Wards are separated. Nurses wear linen that is boiled daily. Dishes are washed with more vinegar. Straw is burned more frequently. A chapel near the ward remains open, but attendance is metered. Priests carry oils in small vials, and their visits are recorded to make sure no one is overlooked. The hospital's water supply is checked because contamination multiplies troubles. A member of the city's board visits at specified hours, not to interfere, but to reassure by presence. The hospital's ledger records gifts that arrive, money, linens, food, and sends thanks not by letter, but by lists posted at church doors, a public gratitude that becomes part of the city's self-image. Poor relief expands along familiar channels. Confraternities ask more of their members. Nobles reopen purses. The pawn bank extends repayment periods. A few merchants set up soup distributions in front of their warehouses at midday. All of this is recorded with a practical bent. Names of donors, quantities dispensed, days served. The aim is not to build a statue in memory of an event, but to sustain a habit until crisis recedes. When the board meets to review outcomes, they do not discuss abstractly the soul of the city. They count numbers and assess where the routines failed. Then they adjust assignments and carry on. When the plague wave passes, the city does not declare victory, it declares inventory. Officials check the state of wells, the numbers of orphaned children, the capacity of guilds to absorb new apprentices, the number of houses needing repair. Orphan care flows through an institution that knows its roles: intake, placement with wet nurses, later return and instruction, eventual apprenticeship or marriage with a small dowry. The records kept here are heartbreaking in their thinness and beautiful in their persistence. A child once a foundling becomes a shoemaker. His simple mark stands at the bottom of the paper that records his acceptance into a guild. This is the city's victory, continuity through paper and habit. Elsewhere in quieter rooms, family ledgers host small renegotiations. Dowries are adjusted to reflect changed fortunes. Contracts are modified by mutual consent, recorded in the margin, and then copied by a notary for clarity. Wills are revised to include guardians for younger children. These acts require no poetry. They require good pens, fresh sand, a hard table, and a precise hand. A household returns to cooking and washing with a sadness that will linger for years, but with the relief of routines resumed. The washing of linens every third day, the scouring of pots with ash, the airing of bedding on bright mornings. These become little rituals of survival turned ordinary again. The city's tax office reopens, with lists of remissions and new assessments spread across a table. Remissions forgive payments for those who have lost all. New assessments spread burdens carefully to avoid breaking those who barely held. The process is not perfectly just, but it is publicly recorded so everyone can see how the city tries. Complaints are filed, appeals are heard. The procedure protects the city more than the individual. It is slow mercy written in tidy columns. When you stand in a church and look at a fresco painted in calmer times, you notice that people visit these images not for escape, but for alignment. The scenes teach that suffering sits inside a larger order. The city's administrators have their own version of this lesson. They write down lists that align daily tasks with the ideal of a community that refuses chaos. In the aftermath of disease, their lists are shorter but more frequent. Repair this pipe, inspect that bridge, test the scale at the fish market, pay the night watch, authorize the purchase of lime for whitewash. Each list item is small, the sum is civilization. Returning to the square at dusk, you watch a baker choose to keep the oven warm for an extra hour to accommodate a neighbor who arrived late. This unrecorded courtesy might be the most important action of the day. The city runs on such courtesies as much as on statutes. The records sit in archives, the courtesies sit in memory, and in the habit of expecting the best from one another until proven otherwise. If you believe that the Renaissance was a blaze of genius, look here and see that the truer light of the era was a steady lamp over a ledger and a steady fire inside an oven. And then ask yourself, when the next crisis comes with a new name and the same hunger, which part of this patient machinery will we value most, the written instructions pinned to doors or the unwritten ones carried from neighbor to neighbor at the pace of a human step? You return to a quieter season, when the city rehearses improvements learned in hard times. The grain office has refined its signals. Notices about expected shipments are posted earlier. Sale schedules are coordinated with river barges and mule trains, so transfers happen with less loss. A clerk has developed a simple chart to predict shortages based on 3 facts captured weekly: price at the source, time to transport, and inventory in city granaries. The chart is not prophecy, it is a device for attention. It teaches the office to look at the right things on the right days. In an age before the words you know for such charts, this is just a page with columns and a habit of looking, but the effect is the same, fewer surprises. Bakeries adopt small innovations. Some divide ovens into compartments to bake loaves for different neighborhoods in separate batches, so distribution is smoother. Journeymen keep notebooks of ratios that work in different weather. How much water on a dry winter morning? How much kneading when the flour is from a different mill? These notebooks are not literature. They are procedural memory written down so each baker does not have to relearn what a neighbor already tested. Apprentices inherit these notes along with skills. The collection of such notebooks across trades is a hidden library of the city, updated in chalk and ink at the scale of hands and hours. Hospitals introduce admission registers that code cases into categories: fever, wound, childbirth, aged, which allows the steward to predict demand for certain supplies. The steward draws up a monthly list for the market: linen, vinegar, candles, simple herbs, wood for heating. He arranges deliveries by streets to save cart time, a small efficiency that becomes a habit. A surgeon keeps a book of outcomes, not as a scientific work, but as a memory aid. How often a certain poultice helped, how often it did nothing. Over years, this private arithmetic inclines practice away from what fails and toward what helps, and this inclination accumulates into a tradition, quietly refined. Water management grows more competent through the dull bravery of inspection. Conduits are checked on the first Monday of each month. Fountainheads are scraped free of moss in spring. The city hires stonecutters for small repairs and pays them by the job, recorded in a notebook that survives because it continues. A decayed gutter is replaced. A covered drain is cleared. Fines are levied for illegal taps into lines. The carpenter notes in his book that the wooden covers on certain drains wear faster because carts wheel over them. He suggests iron straps. The city adopts the suggestion because it is not expensive. Improvement rarely arrives as a plan, it arrives as unboastful acceptance of good ideas. The tax office suffers less delay because its clerks have adopted a standard form for petitions that reduces confusion. The form is copied by stationers and sold cheaply. Petitioners fill blanks for name, address, reason, requested relief, supporting facts. The uniformity speeds reading, reduces error, and makes denial less arbitrary because similar cases now look similar on paper. This shift does not change the world dramatically, but it reduces friction. You begin to see that the city's intelligence resides less in its brightest minds than in its willingness to accept better forms. Confraternities catalogue their members' skills alongside names. When a crisis arrives, they know who can carry her. Litters, who can read notices aloud, who can cook for many at short notice, who can dig, who can repair shoes, who can sit with the sick and not complain. This catalogue is a map of resilience. It suggests that you do not need heroes when you possess a roster of people willing to be useful. Minutes of meetings now include small training notes: how to lift a body, how to avoid back injuries, how to disinfect linen with sunshine and time. If you find such minutes centuries later, you might yawn. If you live with them, you rest easier. Printing House collaborates with the Health Office to produce standard notices for quarantine, for street closures during repairs, for bread prices, for tax deadlines. The notices have a recognizable layout so that even those who cannot read know by the border and the city's seal that the paper matters. This layout becomes part of the city's visual identity. Repetition breeds recognition. Recognition breeds compliance. Compliance reduces the need for force. Consistency here is not art, it is governance. In the schools, children learn sums with beans on tables and with numerals on paper. The teacher uses printed sheets to show methods for addition, subtraction, and the new forms of reckoning that merchants prefer. The presence of such sheets in poorer schools marks a change. What once was a private skill migrates into common practice. The city's future clerks, bakers, carpenters, and nurses learn to anchor their minds on numbers as if they were hooks in a wall. That anchoring produces better inventories, fairer shares of flour in a household, and more accurate change in the market. The fascination you might bring to the equations dissolves here into the comfort of predictability. Dowries become more transparent. Families deposit portions in public offices that keep registers secured by seals so that disputes later have a neutral memory to consult. The practice protects women against disappearance of their rights and protects families against slander. The ledger's dull lines carry a kind of moral tone, a tone that says, "We will act decently because decency has been written down and can be verified without shouting." You stand on a quay at dawn where the sea smells like coins left in a wet pocket. Salt clings to everything, ropes, eyebrows, the wooden rail. A pilot squints into a wind that pushes differently than yesterday, and he adjusts his expectations with the smallest tilt of head. If you watch him long enough, you see that his tools are not secrets. He carries a compass in a box, a sandglass hung by a cord, a lead line coiled with a lump of tallow at its base, a rudder, a book of directions for coasts, and a memory that holds a coastline in sound and smell as much as in sight. The pilot's work is routine, sharpened by risk. The ship he boards has been made ready by a choreography that looks chaotic until you listen for counts. Crew load casks of water and wine into the hold, arranged so that sloshing is minimized by baffles and by careful stowage against bulkheads, biscuit in sacks, salted meat in barrels, dried legumes in bags, oil and vinegar in small amphorae nested with rope. The victualler's list is specific, adjusted by experience for length of voyage and typical consumption, so many pounds per man per week, an extra allowance for heavy work, a reserve for days when the sea defeats cooking. Fire is dangerous aboard, so cooking is controlled, often in a brick box where the flame is tamed. Every item has a place, every place has a justification. The captain's book notes where everything sits, because a ship is a balance, and imbalance is a hazard. The pilot confers with the master and the owner's agent about route, season, and cargo. He speaks in distances measured not in miles but in watches and winds. He names headlands as if they were people. He mentions the set of a current near a point, the smell of land that comes on a certain breeze, the sound a lead makes when it strikes a bottom of sand rather than mud. His rudder, hand-copied or printed, holds pages of directions that read like prayers to those who do not sail. Steer west-southwest until the island lifts. Keep the small white tower on the hill in line with the church until you are clear of the shoal. If the wind comes hard off the land at evening, expect it to fall after midnight. Beware the false light shown by fishermen on certain feast days. These sentences have the dignity of boredom. They also save lives. As the ship leaves the harbour, the pilot counts with the sand glass. The glass marks half hours, and each time it empties, a sound, a call or a tap passes along the deck. Watches are set in blocks of 4 hours, usually split to stagger fatigue. The log line, with its knots at intervals, may be cast to estimate speed by counting knots that pass in a set time. On some ships it is still the older habit of judging speed by eye and wake, but the presence of a line with knots, primitive, imperfect, marks a shift toward measuring with tools the things that bodies once measured by feel alone. Dead reckoning is the art of adding distance and direction over time to estimate position when landmarks are absent. The pilot holds this sum in his head and on a slate, updating with each glass and each turn of wheel. The compass helps, but it is not the tyrant you may imagine. In some places the needle behaves oddly, in others it is steady as a sense of decorum. Pilots learn to trust it enough to be comforted, but not enough to be lulled. They keep it away from nails and knives that warp its bearing. They know declination. The difference between magnetic north and true north exists even if they lack a precise measure. They compensate by habit along familiar routes and by caution along new ones. The device is valuable less for accuracy than for its capacity to show consistency. A steady bearing, even if wrong by a few degrees, is better than no bearing at all. Inlandsmen romanticize stars at sea. Pilots do not. They use them to check latitude by the height of a familiar star or of the sun at noon. A cross-staff or a simple quadrant serves well enough. Tables, scribbled in a notebook or printed in a small booklet, give rough values to compare. The latitude check reassures more than it directs. It is a sign that the sums of dead reckoning have not drifted too far. Longitude remains guesswork, a matter of adding estimation to hope. The hourglass tells time in a way that suffices for watches, but not for precise position. So the pilot returns to his gifts: smell, sound, color of water, the shape of swell, the behaviors of birds, the feeling of a change in air that hints land is near even before sight admits it. When land appears, the rudder becomes a choir of specificities. The pilot reads the coast as if it were a text he has memorized but still recites out loud in case he forgets a line. He keeps a landmark in a certain bearing to avoid a bar. He looks for pale patches in green water that signal sandbanks. He watches how waves break when they meet a hidden ridge. He sends a boat ahead with a man sounding with the lead, calling depths in the old chant of soundings. The tallow at the lead's base brings up a smear that tells bottom: sand, mud, shell, rock, each with its own adhesion. This knowledge, catalogued and repeated, turns unknowns into manageables. In ports, pilots are licensed by local authorities, who wish to prevent wrecks that cost lives and goods. The license is a sheet with signatures and a seal stored in an oiled case. It specifies the waters in which the pilot is competent and the fees allowed. Pilots take oaths and pay dues. They meet to share changes: new sand where a storm cut, a broken beacon, a foul anchor on a usual berth. The association functions like every guild you have seen. It codifies competence, polices members, and offers help to widows when the sea succeeds in its old business of swallowing the experienced with the careless. The tone is modest and practical. The sea does not respect big speeches. Cargo stowage occupies more attention than you might expect. Heavy goods in the bottom, light atop, but distributed so that the ship rides true on both tacks. Dunnage, scraps of wood, keeps casks from bruising each other and allows water to run free to the pump well. Pumps are tested at the start of each watch. A man turns the handle, another counts strokes, someone notes whether the bilge rises faster than yesterday. If it does, a search begins. Seam, strake, oakum, plug. The language of repair is as old as boats and as new as the last storm. A spare spar lies ready. A sailmaker sits with a palm and needle. A carpenter keeps wedges in a bag tied to his belt because speed of response is as much a tool as any hammer. A voyage is a schedule presented to weather as a polite request. The pilot knows that the schedule will be honored only when it pleases the wind, and so he pads time in conversations with merchants. He speaks of likely arrivals, knowing the word likely is both a shield and a truth. Insurance contracts, when they exist, write the same word formally and charge for the comfort it gives. A policy turns chance into numbers and numbers into money that will be paid later to mend a present loss. The practice depends on paper and on trust, and both emerge, as everything in this era does, from a habit repeated often enough to be believed. On deck, the watch system knits crew into a pattern that survives fatigue. 2 watches alternate, bells marking the halves of hours. The ship lives on these pulses. Meals arrive on time, ropes are coiled by habit, tar is spread where water gnaws. A man assigned to the helm keeps a slight pressure with his right hand that he prefers to his left. Preferences multiplied become culture. The pilot tolerates preferences that do not interfere with safety and corrects those that do. He is not a tyrant. He is a memory with authority. In certain ports where tides rule, pilots time entrances like midwives. The bar across a river mouth demands a half tide. The eddies near a mole allow safe turnings only at slack water. The tide tables in his bag are approximate. His experience adds precision. He may anchor to wait, paying out scope until the cables. Catenary lies like a sagging line, then noting the ship's shear to judge the current's change. Anchors and cables are the ship's brakes. The pilot treats them with as much respect as the cook treats water. He knows that ground tackle badly used is as dangerous as a reef. If you leave the pilot standing on the foredeck and look back at the shore, you see the web that supports his profession. The chandlery sells rope, pitch, canvas, blocks, and iron of certain proven sizes. The rope walk twists fibers into strands and strands into rope in a long, narrow building where a boy spends his youth walking backward. The sail loft smells of canvas and wax. Patterns are chalked on the floor and altered to match a ship's quirks. The chart seller stocks Portoland charts with coastlines drawn to match pilot's memory, latticed with rum lines that help align, bearing with pen. None of these shops think of themselves as making history. They think of themselves as making departures possible. When you lean against a bollard and let this all wash over you, the central realization is calm. The sea's romance survives only where routines defeat its appetite. The pilot's craft is a library of repeated acts, soundings, bearings, tacks counted, men relieved, meals cooked, pumps worked, sails mended, cargo checked, papers signed. The library is oral and written, private and communal. It grows by accretion. The newest entry is a note scratched into a rutter. Beware the new sand near the river's mouth. A boat came to grief there in a southerly. That sentence will save someone you will never know. If you were to ask the pilot a grand question, what is navigation? He might shrug and say, to know enough to be unsurprised. And then you might ask, when the tools change, the hourglass to a better clock, the hand-drawn chart to a printed one, does the job change, or does it only change the kinds of mistakes you are able to make? You return when the pilot is ashore. For a few days, bent over a table with a chart and a set of dividers. The chart is not a world map with monsters, but a coastal guide made from soundings and experience. It shows ports with their approach lines, capes with their bearings to each other, and notes like quiet advice. Good holding in sand, avoid shelter in northerly, water at the fountain behind the church. The dividers click against the paper as the pilot paces distance along a rum line. His mind holds the differences between paper and water, the swell that will lengthen a day, the foul bottom that will challenge an anchor, the crosswind that will require tacking and add distance invisible on the line. He marks allocation of time on the margin, so many watches to here, so many to there, because his promise to the owner rests more on how long than how far. The rudder on the table has been amended through generations. Some entries are neat, written with a careful hand, others hurried and stained. The book carries registers of soundings, coastal silhouettes, and distilled instructions that care more for outcomes than for reasons. The text refuses romance. It uses ordinary measurements, fathoms, leagues, points, because fancy words do not hold a ship off a lee shore. The pilot annotates a page with a new position for a beacon moved last spring. He erases a warning that no longer applies because a shoal has shifted. The rudder's authority is its immediacy, not its antiquity. A neighbour arrives to talk of sails. Rigs change as voyages change. The pilot weighs the merits of a new fore and aft sail that allows closer windward work against the old square sail's resilience and simple rigging. Change is measured by repair costs and crew skill. A ship that can claw off a lee shore with a more modern rig may justify its expense by surviving one bad blow in 10 years. The pilot is cautious. He has learned that improvements widen the boundaries of error as well as of safety. The sea forgives neither. Insurance brokers meet at a tavern nearby to set premiums. They speak in a plain language that reduces risk to rates. Route, season, cargo, captain's record, pilot's record, and last, an intangible. Whether the pilot is the sort who writes in his rudder or the sort who trusts his memory alone. The former type pays less because others trust his habits. The latter pays more because bravado did not impress the sea last time and will not now. The broker's notebook is the sea's ledger translated into money. In the shipyard, a hull sits on stocks. Carpenters measure scantlings with rules worn smooth. Trees are bent into frames with heat and time. Copper is not yet plating hulls, but pitch and oakum fill seams. Tar dresses rope, lamp black and oil paint the upper works. The master shipwright is, like the pilot, a memory with authority. He presses his thumb into a plank and listens to its creak. He writes numbers on wood more often than on paper and spends his arithmetic in lines rather than accounts. His product is a compromise between strength and speed, depth and draft, cargo and crew. The compromise reflects the city's needs: grain carriers deep, coasters flat, riverboats shallow and broad. The multiplicity of hulls answers the multiplicity of trades. Crews are hired by articles, written agreements that lay out pay by the month or by the share, rations and rules. Men sign with names or marks. The articles list what is forbidden: drunkenness at sea, theft of food, violence with weapons, and what is required: obedience to officers, care of gear, attendance at muster. The pilot reads these clauses not as abstractions, but as tools. They give him the authority to order men aloft and to punish in measured ways. They protect him, too, because they define his duties. If loss occurs within the boundaries of the articles, he is judged by peers, outside, then by courts who care less for the sea's ways. The paper is a bridge between two understandings of fairness. Before departure, the pilot walks the deck with the master, checking lashings, measuring the freeboard by eye, listening to the pump, sniffing for a leak of oil or vinegar that would signal a broken container. They look at the weather with a fisherman's attention. Cloud types, wind, smell, swell direction, the behavior of birds. The decision to depart is not a decree, it is a consensus between the senses and the schedule. They leave when both sides can live with the choice. The pilot writes the date in a small notebook because dates anchor arguments later. At sea, the pilot attends to the craft of redundancy. He keeps more than one timekeeper, even if both are sandglasses, and offsets their starts to catch error. He stores the compass away from iron and checks the card's swing when the ship rolls. He keeps a rough log and a neat one. The rough catches immediate figures, the neat copies them when the sea allows, with small comments that soften memory's sharp corners. Poor visibility, set to west more than expected, current stronger off the Cape, one sail split in squall, pumps every half hour in the second watch. Food routines are not merely comfort, they are discipline that keeps men useful. Biscuit is aired in fine weather to drive weevils out, meat is rationed carefully, pulses are soaked to soften, vinegar is mixed with water to mask staleness and to keep mouths clean. The cook's corner is civilized by small courtesies. Cleanliness demanded, fire kept low and safe, pots scrubbed with sand. Illness is treated with what the era knows, herbs, simple syrups, rest. The pilot's medicine is prevention, schedule, diet, clean water when possible, caution with new foods in foreign ports. Scurvy lurks without a name, oranges and greens are welcomed without explained reasons, just experiences, quiet approval. Navigation, in fog, becomes a liturgy of careful choices. The pilot reduces sail to a conservative set, keeps the ship under control, sounds more often, places a man forward to listen for surf, rings a bell, and listens for the answer from others. He knows that a reef does not become smaller when he worries, it becomes smaller when he takes away speed and increases information. The crew's annoyance at slowness is a lesser danger than the shore's certainty. A story circulates in every port about a captain who would not slow and who paid the shore with his hull. Stories are instruction wrapped in a format that men remember. On clear days, the pilot lets the crew practice drills, setting and dowsing sails, tacking and wearing, checking pins and lashings, running out a kedge anchor to warp off a lee shore, launching boats. Drills are as boring as they are necessary. The sea abhors novelty, and drills turn crisis into repetition. The pilot's authority grows not from shouting in storms, but from insisting on drills in calm. He knows that the body learns before the mind explains. When the ship enters a strange port, the pilot waits for the local license. He offers to pay the harbour pilot, who knows the channel's last month's changes and the official's last week's moods. Pride has no place here. The smartest pilots accept being piloted where local knowledge beats memory. Fees are set. Signals given. Boats surge and fall. The ship rides the tide. On the quay, customs men wait with pens already dipped. Papers exchange hands, seals are broken and pressed again. The ship's cargo becomes the city's numbers. Fees return the ship to neutrality. The pilot knows how to be polite and brief. He has learned that a clerk asked an extra question because the last captain lied. Courtesy shortens suspicion. While the cargo is unloaded, the pilot walks the dock and exchanges information. He notes prices of rope and pitch, asks about the last merchant to go missing, hears the rumor of a new sandbank near a cape he will round next week. He does not traffic in gossip for entertainment, he traffics in it for safety. He updates his rudder that evening, adding small lines that matter. New buoy set by the western spit. Bell hung on the point. rock awash marked by white post. Wine cheaper upriver. Water foul at the lower well. The book becomes a portrait of the sea as it changes year by year. When a gale is forecast by whatever signs the era trusts, the pilot speaks with the master about options. If at anchor, veer more cable, drop a second anchor, set a riding sail to ease strain, clear the decks, check chafing gear on ropes, batten hatches. If at sea, he reduces sail early, he knows that the wind will take what you do not give. Better to give first. He keeps the ship's bow toward the sea if possible, avoids a lee shore by any means, heaves to if necessary to rest the crew and prevent drift into danger. He measures success not by speed, but by the ship's continued existence. When men complain that they are making no way, he says with his sparse humor, we are making our way to tomorrow. The pilot's identity is a stack of small proofs, a license, a neat rudder, a reputation among insurers, a quiet captain's confidence, a crew's grudging respect, a ledger of safe arrivals. He does not attend academies, though he might, in later years, send his son to one. He reads tide tables if he has them, and he reads water always. His science is the accumulation of prudence. If you expect a speech, you miss the point. He trusts schedules, tools, paper, and men in that order because those are the things that have saved him most often. He knows how to accept help, how to decline foolishness, and how to wait. Waiting is a tool disguised as patience. Standing with him at the quay as evening gathers, you feel the sea's invitation and its warning. The pilot has learned to hear both at once, and because he listens, he returns. He turns his face to the wind and sniffs. Tomorrow, he says without drama, the breeze will back. We will leave on the second bell. And you wonder, as the stars prick, into view above a black water that hides its hand, if a better clock and a better chart arrive in his lifetime, will the pilot be freer or only differently bound? And will the new precision keep him safer or simply change the stories men tell? When they survive? You meet the pilot at a table where a new book lies open, printed rather than copied. A manual that lists latitudes of ports, declinations of the sun, corrections for instruments, instructions for using a mariner's astrolabe. He reads without awe. The book is useful. It will spare him a few sums and provide tables that his apprentice can follow. It will not replace his rudder or his eye. It is another tool in the larder, like a better knife. He tests the book by comparing its values. To ones he knows, he marks a few corrections in the margin. Books for him are proposals to be tested, not authorities to be obeyed. A printed chart lies nearby showing more of the ocean than he has sailed, crisscrossed by lines that promise order at angles. He recognizes his coast, smiles at a misplaced beacon, and frowns at a shoal drawn smaller than he would. This blend of recognition and doubt is healthy. He will use the chart for planning and ignore its art when the sea contradicts it. In this, you see the true temperament of the era. Embrace improvements without worshipping them. The pilot remains the pilot. The chart is an aid that must be amended by a pencil that he keeps tucked in his hatband. The ship he prepares now is larger, a deep boat for a trip that will cross open water between lands farther apart than he prefers. The victualler's list grows accordingly. Some barrels are double-hooped to survive long knocks. Water is stowed in the middle where temperature swings less. Vinegar and oil are put high to avoid tainting water if they leak. He tests casks by tapping and listening for a certain note, the way a baker listens to bread. He divides food into weak lots by habit so portions do not drift under boredom or greed. A punishment awaits theft of food. It is severe because rations are promises the ship must keep to itself. He spends an afternoon drilling the crew on emergencies they may never encounter: fire drill with wet blankets, man overboard with a boat dropped and recovered, rudder damage with ropes ready to rig a bite, jury set up, mast damage with a spare spar, and a plan to reduce sail area. The crew grumbles but complies. He knows that the repetition builds pathways in their hands that panic cannot erase. He rewards compliance with a bit of extra wine. Leadership at sea is the management of stamina. On this voyage, he intends to use lunar distance methods whispered about in learned circles, but not yet practical for many. He has no sextant. His quadrant and cross staff are clumsy for it. He tries once, twice, makes notes, and admits the method, for now, exceeds his tools. This admission takes no heroism, it is ordinary sense. He returns to dead reckoning and latitude, sailing. Two methods that, joined with caution, suffice. He tells his apprentice that someday there will be a clock that keeps time across latitudes and a device that will make measuring angles easy for any man with steady hands. He does not treat this forecast as a promise. He treats it as a forecast, useful to remember, not useful to bet a hull on. In harbours along the way, he watches how networks grow. A port establishes a board of pilots. A school convenes where young men learn to read charts and to take noon heights before ever they smell tar. A court hears disputes about collisions and judges fault with reference to rules written down and taught. Rules about who keeps clear, who signals first, who reduces sail. This codification turns custom into instruction, and instruction into law. He approves, not because he loves law, but because confusion at sea kills as surely as rocks. If a rule reduces confusion, he welcomes it and places it on the shelf in his mind alongside his lead line. Commerce writes its own incentives. Merchants demand predictability, insurers demand prudence, authorities demand compliance, crews demand fairness. The pilot sits where these demand lines cross and learns to speak all four languages. He provides predictability by giving ranges, not dates, prudence by declaring limits he will not cross, compliance by knowing signals and papers, fairness by observing the articles when dividing bonus money after a safe and profitable voyage. He shapes the voyage by balancing these weights like cargo in a hold. The sea reminds him to be humble. A storm arrives that exceeds forecasts. He orders sail reduced to bare poles and the ship hove to on a tack that keeps her clear of a lee shore. Known and feared, men tie themselves to lines. The deck alternates between slope and waterfall. The pumps keep a steady background labor. Hours stretch. He thinks of small mistakes that might become big ones: a shackle pin working loose, a knot creeping, a seam opening. He orders inspections even in the gale's howl, because habit survives where thought frays. At dawn, the storm eases. The tally stands. One sail ruined, no men lost. One cask split. Pumps kept the bilge honest. He writes these in his notebook not as boast but as record. Records prevent false pride. At a foreign quay, he encounters charts of that coast drawn by locals with a different style of drawing wind and water. He buys one and compares it with his own sense and his printed chart's lines. He recognizes that local charts contain clues that his lacks: a shading where a river's silt extends farther than you would guess, a note about a smell near a marsh that carries a mile out on a south wind and so signals a safe bearing at night. He adds such clues to his rutter, enriched by voices that will never meet but will travel alongside his. This is how knowledge multiplies without ceremony. The pilot's relationship with time deepens. He learns to view watches not as cages but as containers. Inside each container, he must perform a set of observations: bearing, speed, sail trim, crew condition, weather tendency. He holds each observation accountable to the next, building a chain that can be thrown forward in imagination to the next headland. This structure of attention is the pilot's true instrument. He could work with worse tools if his attention is well ordered. He cannot work with the best tools if his attention is scattered. He practices attention as if it were rowing, steady pulls that move a heavy boat. As rumors of better instruments spread, more accurate hourglasses, better compasses, printed sailing directions with tides noted for many ports, the pilot feels not displaced, but supplemented. He is old enough to remember the chore of copying, a rutter by hand, and young enough to appreciate a clean printed page. He tells his apprentice to trust the new while keeping hands ready for the old, because the sea prefers redundancy. If the new device breaks, the old device does not become an antique, it becomes primary. He once used a lead line to find safe water. He will always use it. He now also uses a printed tide table to choose the best hour to cross a bar. Both are true. Both save. On a street near the harbour, he stops at a shop that sells books of voyages. He reads a page about a coast he will not see and smiles at a description of a wind with a name he knows by a different name. Maybe names change while winds do not. The book makes him think of sailors as a single community spread thin around. The world, united by tools, divided by tongues, and conjoined by the knowledge that repetition keeps you alive. He closes the book, pays a coin, and walks out with the book tightly wrapped against spray. You follow him one last time onto a deck as he brings a ship into his home harbour. The wind is contrary, so he tacks in a confined channel, timing each, turns so the ship gains without touching. Boats scuttle, gulls complain, the smell of land rises, and a bell rings the hour that divides one day from another. He orders the anchor dropped with a chain that rattles like rain on a roof. The ship swings, settles, points into the stream. He breathes and writes the time in his notebook by habit. Men smile. The voyage is finished. They will unload, be paid, drink, and sleep in beds that do not move. If you seek a morale, let it be modest. The pilot's craft did not overturn the world. It made possible the safe movement of goods and people that paid for the art and letters you admire in other rooms. His routines kept salt and storms from breaking promises. In an age of renown, his was a fame that took the form of names spoken at the right tables when reliability was needed. When you leave the quay and return to your own rooms, consider this uninteresting truth. Civilization's long voyages depend less on wonders than on the repeated acts of people who consult lists, train hands, check knots, and then move anyway. As instruments improve, will such people be honored more because the risks they manage are clearer? Or will they be forgotten because the tools seem to do the work and the hand becomes invisible again?